Chapter 501, Tattoos. Scylla's gaze flashed as he quickly took in the surroundings. They were in an open square in the middle of the village, corpses were littered around, and there wasn't just more than a dozen meters squared or so to maneuver around. To his back, there was a large number of Ravenclaws trying to stop his forward charge, and there were a few more stragglers in the village that wanted to do the same. But honestly, Scylla couldn't believe the disorganization. If they hurried to support Ragnar like this, the Grimblades would have an easier time penetrating the defenses as well. Unless, he was confident in the fact this poison would be able to stop him. Unfortunately for Ragnar, though, while Scylla had feared this poison the first time they met, it wasn't at a level that could harm him at all now. Not only had he already analyzed the rune that formed this poison, even if he hadn't, his poison affinity alone would have been enough for him to control the ether in the surroundings to keep it away from him. A silver-grade poison affinity wasn't something the likes of Ragnar could stand up to. Is he really so foolish? There was enough plausible deniability to go around. A lone person should be easy to deal with, so fair enough. But, by that same token, if Ragnar really thought he was a normal lone person, he wouldn't be investing this much manpower into it either. I see. Scylla seemed to have finally thought of something. But instead of being shaken, he was only calmer. A spear appeared before his face, and he took a step back. The blade didn't carry a lot of power, but it was fast, sharp, and accurate. Ragnar's dress pants and shirt didn't seem to hinder him in the slightest as he moved with a shocking flair to him. Maybe it was just his personality, but Scylla felt like the weapon before him had real life. Ragnar was exceptionally skilled, and Scylla, who had been expecting to find a quick method of counterattack or a hole to exploit, quickly found that he actually couldn't. I've underestimated him. Though he had this thought, he remained calm. The heir candidates for these families had been preparing since their youth. The fact his skill was even close to theirs was a testament to Scylla's talent, not their lack of effort. Scylla parried the body of the spear to the side, and a glint lit in Ragnar's eyes. Spikes laced with poison jetted out and cut into Scylla's arm, hooking into him. Ragnar pulled back, ripping Scylla's flesh along with his efforts and leaving a bloody gash down his forearm. Scylla frowned. It had cut into his scales. This wasn't just a small parlor trick. This spear was specially designed to be used with poison. Of course it would have such hidden traps. The feeling of a foreign poison pulling into his body was unpleasant, but it was easily suppressed by his superior ice poison. By the time he had gotten it under control, Ragnar's spear was already following up in a flurry. It carried a speed that was clearly a few percentage points faster, and their afterimages made the blade particularly hard to track. He's taking advantage of my distraction. Scylla was constantly waiting for the men around them to take action, but they were biding their time perfectly. In fact, they had set up a nice formation, blocking him in while retreating their line of defense against the Grimblades enough that they could manage both situations. Okay, in that case. Scylla pressed a foot down into the ground and slipped his head to his side. He formed a sturdy base, and he no longer dodged. His fists clanged against the rain of spear thrusts. Every solid collision made it sound as though metal was clashing against metal. He seemed to have completely forgotten that there were enemies around, and the moment he focused on Ragnar, it was no longer a one-sided attack fest. Scylla shifted and flowed, his body like a symphony and his tendons like their plucking strings. Every strike he sent brought with it 100% effectiveness, his stats being maximized to the greatest degree. Ragnar, who had been relaxed until now, felt the change immediately. His spear strikes weren't landing as true as before, and his wait for the poison to begin affecting Scylla wasn't bearing any fruit. Bang! Scylla's gaze flickered as a rebounding force came from the side of Ragnar's head. He had suddenly summoned his pauldron just now, but an automatic defense triggered just when he was about to catch Ragnar off guard. The tattoos. Interesting. Just now, there was a forceful circulation of ether triggered that passed through one of the tattoos on Ragnar's body. Realizing an easy victory wasn't in the cards, the rest of General Aileen's armor appeared. Or at the very least, the pieces Scylla used the most often. Less than mirror step activated, and Ragnar was pressed to his back foot. The pauldrons hovered around Scylla's mirror image, making it look as though there were truly two of him fighting against Ragnar. The pressure increased. Scylla weaved in and out, swapping locations and pivoting around his clone freely. Bang, bang, bang. Ragnar stumbled back and then stumbled back again. His footing was thrown off, and his defenses became sloppy. Scylla's fist slipped through and clashed right against his chest, only for another barrier of defenses to activate. A pauldron slammed into his back at the same time as Scylla's pincered him from both sides. Ragnar found himself being shaken from both sides, but he still stood his ground expertly. Taking advantage of his strong defenses, he took an opportunity to slip out. His tattoos flared with life and his aura changed. The seriousness on his expression could no longer be hidden as an illusory armor clamped down around him. A translucent scorpion tail curled from his back, and its carapace coated Ragnar from head to toe. Chapter 502, Trap. Suddenly, Ragnar had two weapons to attack with. His tail swiped out at Scylla's clone while his spear thrust out at the real Scylla's. However, to his astonishment, his spear went right through this so-called real Scylla's. At some unknown point, Scylla's had swapped with his clone in the mess of the battlefield. Ragnar found his scorpion tail pinned to Scylla's body and his feet practically ripped up and off the floor. With one elbow pinning the tail to his hip, Scylla's twisted, taking a half step back in a curving arc that pulled Ragnar, who had lost his balance attacking nothing but air, toward him. Scylla's gaze flared with an intense light as his elbow slammed right into the back of Ragnar's neck. The illusory armor shuddered, and poison runes snaked up Scylla's arm. However, he completely ignored them. Although the armor managed to keep itself together, Ragnar's head was jarred forward, and his vision swam. The Ravenclaw's brain rattled around in his skull, and he was disoriented for a full half-second. By the time he recovered, he found that he had been lifted up and off his feet. A feeling of danger he had never experienced in his life before overwhelmed him. Ragnar felt death kissing his neck, a sickeningly sweet scent of blood drilling into his nose. An animalistic sort of instinct, buried deep within his bones, activated at once as his irises, a deep shade of black, overwhelmed his sclera. In that instant, it looked as though his eyeballs had been replaced by a pair of black marbles. His body reacted on its own, his own ether drilling through his body and shattering all of his tattoos at once. He didn't know why he had to do it, but he knew that if he didn't react fast enough, there would only be death waiting for him. In that same instant that he reacted, the scorned raps registered Scylla's attempt to use Ragnar as a weapon. A scream echoed through the air as large patches of Ragnar's skin were burned in an inferno. His nigh-indestructible armor, until this point, was shredded into a rain of ash. The moment Ragnar lost control of his body and Scylla's began to swing him toward the incoming Ravenclaws, the destruction process had begun. Luckily for Ragnar, his Ravenclaw unique gene had triggered an instinctual will of life preservation. His body reacted on its own, much like his tattoos had, cutting away the danger almost like lopping off a poisonous limb. Scylla's gaze flickered as he was somewhat surprised. He had been wondering if Ragnar would lose his life because the tattoos were etched onto his body or if the illusory armor would be seen as a separate entity. Regardless, he thought the worst case would be Ragnar losing this tough armor of his, and the best case would be Ragnar dying outright. What he didn't expect was to get a result smack dab in the middle of the two. Ragnar had survived, but he was practically half dead. The only shame was that because Scylla's had been swinging him around like a weapon, the moment the armor shattered, he was sent flying off into the distance, only to be caught by his people. Those eyes. I was wondering what the Ravenclaw's unique gene was. I'm still not 100% certain, but it seems quite animalistic. Take him away, now. One of the trusted members of Ragnar's faction stepped up to block Scylla's path back to Ragnar, urging the others to bring him away. Scylla's had gotten some information from Sunniva. Most of the core members had protective items on them to hide their stats, but the strongest should be about level 26. That was a young man who went by Gavin Ravenclaw, and he too wielded a spear. With Ragnar heavily injured, he took the vanguard while the others rushed Ragnar away, seemingly looking to escape into the portal. Seeing the situation take a bit of an unfavorable turn, Scylla's wasn't in a rush to dive headfirst into danger again. He looked back toward where the Grimblades were, and they were still locked in battle with the Ravenclaws, who were desperately trying to hold on until the 3-day timer was up. When that time came, the support of the Sylphs would likely not be too far away, and the situation on the ground would change again. However, whether it was the Grimblades or the Ravenclaws, they all looked more than content to keep Scylla's contained. With Silas not taking the initiative to act, Gavrin didn't make a move to attack him first either, taking a defensive posture. As expected, that really is their plan, and Lucia seems more than willing to allow it to happen. But I don't think I understand the full extent of it all just yet. From the very beginning, things had been odd. Sure, he had caught them off guard by flying through the air, but that didn't matter if they were waiting for his appearance one way or another. Not one of them could deal with him on their own, but the sylphs, on the other hand. Well, they would at least have a small chance. Silas' power wasn't overwhelming. His greatest asset was his intelligence and his ability to take his opponents off guard with methods of combat they had never seen before. Ragnar was a tough opponent, but he could have never guessed that he would lose because he lost his footing for a split second. The sylphs, however, they were much more experienced in the ways of this new world, and even if they wouldn't be prepared for all of Silas' tricks, they would certainly have tricks of their own that would be tough for him to react to. But this plan was still too simple. Silas didn't believe that Lucius would be stupid enough to fall for such a thing. In all likelihood, the real place they wanted to draw him to was the Africor continent. That was where the real trap resided. Silas only thought for a moment before he burst forward. Chapter 503, Enter. Gavrin's expression flickered when he saw Silas' action before it returned to normal. But this was still all the confirmation Silas needed to know what was going on. The spear of Ragnar's right-hand man shot forward and suddenly multiplied, forming a net that made it look like he was trying to hold Silas back. With a sudden acceleration, Silas' pauldrons flared with life. His mirror image vanished, its services no longer necessary. He freed up more aspects of his mind, and his will pressed down onto Gavrin, shredding the illusion of his spears apart. Silas' body swayed oddly, and an undetectable burst of ice appeared beneath his feet, sending him flashing to the side in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Gavrin didn't have the time to understand how Silas could both be dodging and still accelerating at the same time. He tried to pull his spear back to defend, this time a light of panic flickering in his eyes, but Silas' fist was too fast. Bang! Gavrin's armor practically deformed as he felt his liver almost fly up and out of his throat. His entire body shut down, and he barely registered his spear being ripped out of his hands. A wave of ash filled the air, only to be blown right into his eyes. Gavrin squinted for the last time in his life. He completely missed the follow-up elbow that drove right into his head. The constitution his armor gave him was surely tough. But with Silas' Muay Thai comprehension increasing by the day, a single elbow or knee strike already had no less than a 60% boost that his fists carried. His nose was driven into his skull, and his frontal cortex began to be riddled with the fragments of his own bones. Before he could even sway to the ground, Silas had bolted by him, his tail swinging out once and sending his corpse spiraling toward half of the oncoming Ravenclaws. Tail whip. The attack didn't slow Silas down in the slightest. His body was like a phantom, weaving in and out of the crowd of warriors with an unconscious speed and an effortless control over his body. He felt like he could see all things, and his body reacted like a well-oiled machine. Even if he was going to hop right into a trap, that didn't mean that he wouldn't make sure to make them suffer a great deal for it. His body leapt up and landed on a dilapidated building. A rain of arrows came at him from what seemed like all sides. In the chaos, it would certainly be easy for a person to mistake it for such. But with his visualization, Silas practically had a bird's-eye view of everything. He could see that the arrows formed a very subtle funnel, giving him just one path that arched toward the portal. In the not too far off distance, the portal was no longer nearly as controlled. It looked like a wildly fluctuating amoeba. Tentacles of ether extended out from it, sometimes randomly flinging items from inside of it, or sometimes randomly capturing those on the outside to be brought back to Earth. It was disordered and seemed precisely like the kind of thing one would want to avoid at all costs. If the portal only caught part of your body, it was possible even to lose entire limbs to the violent teleportation process. It was toward this portal that Ragnar was carried before he and his people escaped. However, Silas, who they likely thought would follow after in the same direction, had other plans. His body flickered, and he seemed to be caught off guard by one of the tentacles of the portal before his body was swallowed up. Brit and Germaine Ravenclaw carried Ragnar to the other side, the gazes firm. The region of the portal they had chosen to enter was one of the most stable and predictable. If they entered anywhere else, it was likely that things would spin out of their control. As expected, though they were flung a few meters off course, it was manageable. The other side of the portal was on the Afrikor continent, and it was quite a dangerous region, known for its poisonous beasts. Since Ragnar had chosen to go all in on his poison attributes, it was the perfect path for him. There was a hot and humid air hanging. It said that hot air rose, but if that was the case, then it could only be said that the so-called cool air of this continent was enough to fry an egg on a regular stone. The region was a mix of sand and sparse trees that extended as far as the eye could see. It seemed quite barren, but only to the untrained eye. In reality, the space was filled with pitfalls and, most importantly, there are still a couple of minutes left until the timer is up, Britt said through gritted teeth. We can hold on that long. We won't be the ones doing the distracting either. They rushed forward, their steps following a very particular pattern. If one looked closely, it didn't seem like the sand they landed on compressed nearly as much as it should. Ragnar's eyes opened slowly to find that he was being jostled around. The pain made him grit his teeth and let out a hiss, but he forced himself to hold it together. There was a sinister light flashing within his gaze as the black marbles retreated and his eyes returned to normal. However, he didn't say a word, nor did he try to direct Britain. Germain. Murderous impulses pulsed all around him. It was do or die now. The trio stopped near the base of a tree and frowned when they didn't notice Silas. The plan was to let him see where they vanished to. Enter, Ragnar said coldly. Britt and Germain hesitated slightly, but in the end, they nodded. If they just stood here like fools and only disappeared after Silas came, it would make it all the more obvious that there was a trap laid here. With a stomp, they fell through the sand and vanished. What they didn't know was that Silas had already appeared on this side, and his visualization was shocked by the underground network beneath his feet. Chapter 504, Decision. Silas' visualization had never been good at looking through barriers. Even when he was in the ocean, it was highly limited by the waters alone. In this situation, even with how porous the sand was, he couldn't see more than a meter or so underground. However, that was enough for him to realize something. The world around him was basically being held up by a large root system. The sparse trees might as well have been on an organic system, connected with one another, sharing resources and water. And it was because of this thick, continuous connection that the sand had anywhere to rest. But if one wasn't careful, it was easy to accidentally slip and fall into this endless network of roots. The shocking part was that before the improvement to his luck, Silas wouldn't have been able to see far enough to realize this at all. He would have thought it was normal sandy ground and likely slipped down by accident, finding himself assaulted by a large number of poisonous creatures. The roots were practically a den for populations of scorpions that seemed to be in the tens of thousands. It was hard to look anywhere and not find a scorpion territory in some situation. If he agitated the roots without thought, he would easily become public enemy number one. Where did the street sign come from? This random thought made Silas pause. When he first got to the battlefield, a spiraling street sign had almost taken his head off his shoulders if not for the fact he caught it before it could. But there didn't seem to be any cities or civilization nearby at all. There seemed to only be two potential explanations. Either it was a remnant from Ragnar's own village, or there was an underground city here somewhere. The portal in the distance looked to be buried into the ground, and Silas felt the odds that a small village like Ragnar's needed street signs were unlikely. In that case, there really was a network down below. Are they trying to lure me to the city? Or do they want to take me down with these poisonous beasts? Silas thought hard, trying to see if he could remember anything about the Afrikor continent having an underground city. But he couldn't recall such a thing. However, he couldn't dismiss it outright either. Unless there's no obvious entrance from what I can see. If this city was created by the Afrikor government, there's no way it would be so hidden. There would have to be a way to get supplies in and out. They wouldn't rely on people slipping in and out like this, which means this city is either a new creation, or it was hidden from the beginning. Silas didn't know how much of his thoughts would be useful, but even if he was going to jump into a trap, it wouldn't be carelessly. There was a reason he had chosen to take this risk, and ironically, that was because he trusted in Lucius' intelligence somewhat. If Lucius really wanted to use a borrowed knife to deal with him, he would know that he would have to sacrifice quite a great deal to do so. The more he was willing to sacrifice, the larger chance Silas would have at gaining something. In addition, Silas had to come to the African continent no matter what to complete his quest. If not, who knew when the next chance would be to step foot here? He had no ability to cross the ocean right now. However, other than these questions, he still had another on his mind. And that was why they wanted him to enter from the same location they had. He had seen their pause and look around. They were definitely trying to bait him. After a long while, Silas made a decision. He would enter from another location. What he didn't notice was that the moment he gingerly landed on the network of roots, there was a slight tremor that followed through them all. Deep underground, a beast with dozens of eyes opened them all at once, allowing a glimmering crimson to fill the dark space. Lucius frowned when he saw how Silas entered. This would definitely throw these matters off. However, when he thought of all the contingency plans and failsafes he had in place, he didn't allow this slight miscalculation to ruin everything. Let's move on to the next phase, Lucius communicated with Nathan secretly. Are you sure? You still have plausible deniability right now, Nathan replied. Lucius didn't reply immediately. He stared off into the distance as his grimblades began to press into the village. One way or another, he was going to stamp out this competition. Contrary to what one might believe, he didn't make any plans with the Ravenclaws, nor did he communicate with the Sylphs. He was using them both. It was just that he knew that the likelihood that they would succeed was minimal. However, if he placed his hands on the scale a bit, it was possible that Silas might really be forced into a corner. It was exactly this sort of ambiguity that made the plan viable. That was because right about now, if Silas had sniffed anything out, he was probably thinking that he was in collusion with the Ravenclaws, whereas in reality, Ragnar was still under the impression that he was working on his own. Funny enough, he and Ragnar both had the same thoughts. Ragnar was about to sacrifice his village for the sake of taking out Silas, believing he could turn the situation around so long as he wasn't around. As for Lucius, he was willing to sacrifice even more than that. He was now standing at a crossroads once more and staring down two options. Nathan was right. If he backed out now, if Silas somehow survived, there was still plausible deniability. But if he did this, there was no going back. I've made my decision, he replied, his gaze calm. Get Bloom here. Chapter 505, Coward's Courage. Silas moved nimbly, hopping from solid route to solid route, his visualization scanning below while he looked for a proper entrance. He wanted something a solid distance away from where the others had entered, but also close enough that he could slowly make his way back when the situation allowed. Soon, he found what he was looking for. He stepped onto the sand and slipped downward. The process was smoother than quicksand. He almost felt like a smooth marble slipping through the sand, falling down below with practically no resistance. When he landed on the ground, it flexed and bowed as though he had landed on a trampoline instead. The visibility was quite low, but with his visualization, he was able to see that the reason for this was that he had landed on a mesh of tree roots. It seemed that even underground, the entire network was formed of these trees. It made the ground a bit unstable and difficult to work with, but Silas got used to it quickly. At the very least, it was easier than fighting on water, and he had already become used to that as well. If necessary, he would just freeze it over and make it even more solid. Though in this humidity, it would be even tougher. The underground space was even hotter than the surface, and there was an uncomfortable stench. This region of the African continent should have been quite dry, but this space in particular seemed to accumulate a ton of water vapor, so much so that a normal human would have had trouble getting enough oxygen to breathe. Silas moved forward, picking his way through the tunnels of branches slowly. It was quite a mess and didn't seem to be very organized. Though, he didn't expect it to be if this was a natural formation. Unfortunately, that made it so that following along often required some innovation. He found himself climbing through the roots and spitting falling sand out of his mouth several times. However, slowly but surely, he was getting closer and closer to the location that Ragnar, Jermaine, and Britt had vanished into. With his visualization, he was able to keep an accurate map in his head, and his steps were measured enough that he could keep track of the distance perfectly. Soon, he felt that he was getting there, but he still hadn't found anything out of the ordinary. Aside from the poisonous critters that were constantly finding chances to attack him, there didn't seem to be much danger at all. However, the more it was like this, the more cautious he became. He knew that the other foot was going to drop soon. It's possible that they're even deeper than this. Silas looked below his feet. There was no reason that this would be the final layer of the mesh network of roots. Just as he was about to approach closer, the situation changed again. Transfer rights of multi-quest less than evergreen territory claim have been given to you by former originator less than Lucius Grimblade greater than. A warrant has been put out for your arrest, you have been labeled a fugitive. You have been set as a kill on sight, target, your privileges have been restricted, your stats have experienced a 50% deduction, your professions have been restricted, restriction failed. Some profession abilities have been limited. Silas watched as the blaring warning notifications popped up before his eyes one after another. He read them one after another, his gaze almost too calm given the situation. His mind, however, was churning as he thought of how this would be possible. If you could just take so many of his stats away, he would have been targeted like this long ago. And also, why transfer the rights of the quest to him? Although he could have taken it whenever he wanted, this was strange. That was when he realized what it was. Bloom. A beacon appeared above Silas' head, and a whirring noise shot out. In the darkness, he became like the one source of light. Bloom hacked up mouthfuls of blood, veins of black crawling up her neck and body as she was placed beneath a great deal of strain. Soon, the pain was too much, and she directly fainted. Lucius looked toward Mark. Take your sister away to be treated. Though he sounded calm, his emotions were churning. He already knew that Bloom would be out of commission after this. But he had expected her to hold on for long enough to tell him how it went. Now he had no idea just how much Silas had been restricted by, and that made things very tricky to handle. He was flying blind again. But once more, he calmed quickly. He had made enough contingency plans that one not going perfectly wouldn't make a large difference. Luckily, because he had expected this, he already had Bloom use her abilities to transfer the multi-quest over to Silas first. But, not before he used a particular item. Coward's Courage, FFF, Treasure. Level, 30. Double the rewards of any quest or multi-quest. Should you fail, suffer demerits proportional to quest grade. Uses left, 0/1. Before, the grade of the multi-quest had been unknown, showing up as. This was because depending on the changes and paths taken during the multi-quest, the grade could change, and thus the challenge could likewise change. But now, thanks to Silas pressing the issue and clearing everything so perfectly for them. Evergreen Territory Claim, Multi-Quest, Silver. The grade had been locked in. Do it, Lucius said. Nathan nodded and sent out the orders. At that moment, all around the Evergreen Territory, Traderoots Lucius had given his blood, sweat, and tears to build up were destroyed. But no sacrifice was harsher than the one of his city itself. You have spent too long away from your city. Your city Stele has collapsed without a leader. And the moment this happened, the multi-quest failed, and Silas suffered a string of demerits. From first on the merit leaderboard, he was erased completely. Chapter 506, Kill on Sight. Multi-quest less than Evergreen Territory Claim Violed, you have suffered a silver demerit. Silas felt as though his body had suddenly been sucked into a vacuum. For the first time since these series of unfortunate events were triggered, his gaze flickered and his expression changed. Right now, he only had a single true merit and one hollow merit. That was lower than a bronze merit, which was lower than a silver merit. You needed 10 true merits to form a bronze merit, and 10 bronze merits to form a silver merit, and obviously 10 hollow merits to form a true merit. That meant that Silas had suddenly lost almost 100 times the merit he had right now in the blink of an eye. That much was already bad enough, but the fallout of what this would mean for him was enough to leave him shaken. It was said that when you entered a state where your demerits outweighed your merits, you would be cursed by the system. In that situation, everything you faced would have an extra hint of difficulty to it. Name, Silas Grimblade. Species, Human, F. Affiliation, Fugitive of the Grimblade lineage. Physical, 260. Greater than, Strength, 260. Greater than, Constitution, 260. Greater than dexterity, 260. Greater than speed, 260. Mental, 294. Greater than intelligence, 321. Greater than wisdom, 422. Greater than charisma, 140. Will, 1999. Luck, 101. Fugitive of the Grimblade lineage. I see. He had deduced long ago that Bloom had a government official-like profession. It was what allowed her to create that license plate out of thin air, and it was also the method through which she scanned him. It seemed that using the fact he was affiliated with the Grimblades, she was able to act in an official capacity and use his own genes as the anchor to mark him as a fugitive. Silas had known that the Grimblade lineage unique gene was a ticking time bomb, but he hadn't been able to get rid of it because it was the foundation for all of his stats. Without it, his original stat limit would be undone, and then his body would come collapsing down like a house of cards. Now that he could extricate blood essence as well, his understanding had grown deeper. He was born with Grimblade blood running through his veins. This was much different from adding the gene after the fact. It was practically worked into the depths of his body, and it was also woven into the fabric of what made him human. Taking it out simply wasn't an option. His will, however, was untouched. Or so it seemed. It was more likely that even after being suppressed by half, his will was still at 1999. After all, it was only stuck at that level because of the gene stat limit. After being reduced to 1000, his extra will bronze genes just activated again to raise it back up to 1999. But there seemed to be something particularly special about his will, or else the same thing would have happened with his other stats as well. After all, they were all in a state of wealth. As for his luck, outsiders had no ability to affect it at all. And yet, even with all of that, the largest problem he faced was probably. Silas looked above his head to find the beacon still flashing. That was supposed to be there to help Grimblades find and capture him, as well as alerting anyone else that he could be returned to the Grimblades for a reward. No, not returned. You have been set as a kill on sight target. Silas didn't move. He stood in silence, breathing in and out. Did he regret coming here? No. Whether he entered or not, Lucius could execute this plan. The difference between here and the outside was that Lucius would be able to maintain a facade of leadership and be trusting of talents. If he was still outside, Lucius would be forced to act to kill him himself, which would erode trust and make his already shaky foundation even more so. But like this, he could rely on the Sylphs and Ravenclaws, while his men, other than his trusted inner circle, would be none the wiser. For him to do this, he definitely gave up quite a lot. He gave up the quest, and for the failure to be so swift, he must have also abandoned his city on top of that. None of the heirs could be underestimated. Lucius didn't try to have his cake and eat it too. He was willing to cut off his nose to spite his face. This was a dangerous man, and it had never been more obvious to Silas than now. Silas took a breath and exhaled slowly. When his eyes opened once more, there was a cold, dense light within. He could feel his blood pumping through his body. He knew what it was. Excitement. It was the reason he had chosen to work with venomous snakes when he chose his graduate student path. It was why he had clicked yes when the trial began. It was why he had felt his life was boring, until now. DUDOOM. The ground shook and the network of roots rumbled. Silas felt as though the floor was falling out from underneath him. A wild tangle of vine-like roots and a waterfall of sand surrounded him. He grabbed to the side, holding onto a root, only for his fingers to feel as though hundreds of tiny needles had ripped into them. Silas' gaze remained an icy cold. He didn't let go, swinging from the branch instead to a foothold, and then leaping again and again. His figure leapt with such speed that the hooks of the branches couldn't seem to keep up. Bang! He landed on sand-dusted limestone, the ancient air of the region practically drilling into his sensory organs. And ahead, lying in a den of wooden webs, he saw it. Woodland Spider Queen. Level, 25. Physical, 1464. Greater than Strength, 1710. Greater than Constitution, 1806. Greater than Dexterity, 1140. Greater than Speed, 1200. Mental, 1670. greater than intelligence, 2850, greater than wisdom, 690. Greater than charisma, 1462. Will, 994. Chapter 507, Scree. You have entered a field dungeon, kill woodland spider queen, to escape Scree. Scylla's icy glare stared into the maw of the enormous spider queen. The violent shift in the root system had allowed the light of the sun to peek through as large amounts of sand fell from above, giving him enough to see the creature before him. It must have been at least 20 meters from its fangs to its large abdomen. Patterns of brown, green, and violet spotted its body, and when it opened its mouth to roar, sizzling, acidic beads of venom fell from its fangs. However, this was the least of Scylla's problems, ironically enough. The first issue was that a field dungeon wasn't something that was supposed to be inescapable. Field dungeon bosses were often locked to certain regions by circumstance. These circumstances could be a pending evolution, pregnancy, or the inconvenience of movement. For this woodland spider queen, its body and this nest of roots seemed to practically be one. If Scylla's was correct, this root system was created by it, which meant that it had put a lot of effort into getting things absolutely perfect. It couldn't move freely as a result, which was why it was a field dungeon boss. The fact he wasn't allowed to escape was purely the system antagonizing him. The issue of his demerits was already rearing its ugly head. And yet, this was still just the first issue. The secondary issue was the fact that this woodland spider queen wasn't alone. The moment its cry echoed out, a large number of spider babies, each one about a meter or so in length, manifested. There were a dozen of them in a flash, and hearing the call of their mother, they scurried forward with menace, venom dripping from their fangs as well. Woodland Spider, FF+. Level, 11. Physical, 163. Greater than Strength, 225. Greater than Constitution, 250. Greater than Dexterity, 84. Greater than Speed, 93. Mental, 144. Greater than Intelligence, 198. Greater than Wisdom, 39. Greater than Charisma, 194. Will, 187. Even as they scurried toward him, Scylla's didn't seem to be willing to do anything but take slow, steady breaths. The odd actions of Bloom had forcefully cancelled his fusion stat, and now it seemed to be on an odd cooldown. There was no way that Bloom could truly suppress his profession completely. It seemed that he had lost access to fusion for the rest of the 128-minute duration he would have had it for. However, other than that, all the other aspects of his profession was still very much there. They're still not acting. I guess it wouldn't be that easy. Scylla's wasn't looking around, but his visualization was probing for where Ragnar and his companions were. He was also looking out for the sylphs, but they were all nowhere to be seen. He was certain that this was the boss they wanted to lure him into fight. There was no way they would just leave well enough alone and hope he died. They were certainly in the shadows somewhere waiting to see if they had to act or not. It seemed that things wouldn't be so easy. All he could do was fight. The Spider Queen is untangling herself. I have no idea how long it will take, but these waves of lesser spiders will likely keep going in the meantime. I have no choice but to try and find a way to kill it before it can free itself from its web. How do you remove a fugitive status tied to affiliation? Fugitive brandings tied to affiliation are inextricably linked to genes. As such, the only way to remove them is with a counter-gene skill, a template, or the aid of a special profession. Scylla's read the notification in a flash as he took a step forward. His breathing even and his gaze firm, he punched out and the head of the first spider shattered, a glow of green amplifying the strength of his fist. There's something wrong. The voice came from an unexpected source. It definitely wasn't the voice of Ragnar, Britt, or Jermaine. Instead, it was a fourth party who seemed to appear from nowhere, his body wrapped in a bubbling violet aura as though his skin was shining itself. Ragnar and the others, though, didn't seem surprised. Ragnar was hurriedly trying to heal himself, but his expression was quite ugly when he saw the state of his body. All of his tattoos would have to be redone. Thinking of the amount of resources he had poured into this, and realizing that he would have to do it again, he couldn't help but grimace. Someone else seems to be targeting him as well. We are getting some outside help, a fifth voice echoed. Yes, But, the sylph with the violet ore appeared forward through the countless branches and roots, trying to see something but not quite able to grasp it. There's also been a change to the field dungeon itself. There are restrictions that shouldn't be there. If we enter, we won't be able to get out. A silence fell. This wasn't part of their plan either. Is this because of this unknown third party? Most likely, but whatever the reason is, we cannot afford to be trapped with that beast. Once it breaks free of its web, its stats will increase further and it will enter a new phase. Anyone trapped in there during that time will be finished. Then let's take it as a good thing. He can't escape and we can simply watch from the sidelines. No need for all the contingency plans we had to stop him from escaping the field. Dungeon. Yes, the violet sylph said slowly. Whoever has trapped him like this is truly sinister. They may be no less of a danger. We will need to watch out. There is no need to guess. Ragnar suddenly spoke, not opening his eyes. It's almost 100% Lucius. The Grimblade. Yes, he does not like variables he cannot control, and this Silas is certainly not someone he can control. He probably wants him dead more than we do. In that case, this man is certainly dead. Chapter 508, Fast. Piercing, lethal. Despite the words of the conspirators hidden in the shadows, Silas didn't seem to be in a rush, nor did he seem pressed. One would have thought that he hadn't lost half of his stats at all. He calmly observed the wave after wave of spiders coming toward him, analyzing their quirks, their habits, and most importantly, their weaknesses. As he grew used to their patterns, the amount of strength he put into each blow began to reduce slowly. At first, every one of his fists aimed for the head, shattering it apart with a forceful blow. But then his stance changed, aiming for the largest eyes at the center of their foreheads and sending a stream of fist aura right into their skulls. However, his tactic didn't last for long. He noticed the twitching hairs on their bodies soon after and how sensitive they were to changes on them. He began to use his telekinesis to brush against them, trying to gauge what sort of reaction they would have. He quickly realized that they were hypersensitive to these changes on their body, and the most violent of them even turned in the direction of his telekinetic touch, opening themselves up to be killed with a swift strike. When Silas settled into a rhythm, it almost became a joke. The disoriented spiders were in part focused on him, and in part on an invisible enemy that didn't exist. By the time the wave of spiders actually reached Silas, he had comprehended their habits and sensitivities so profoundly that they didn't even get a chance to attack him before they died. The stamina usage of Silas slowed to a crawl. In fact, because of his dual-class constitution and his state of wealth, his recovery ability was already ridiculous. Now, he was regaining lost stamina faster than he was using it up. In a battle where he should have been on his back foot, being quickly drained, it was as though he was lightly sparring in his own backyard. However, the only person aware of such profound changes was Silas himself. It would take a very keen eye to realize what he was doing, and his telekinesis was entirely invisible to outside observers without visualization. Even if those hidden in the shadows did have visualizations, they weren't close enough to use them. In their eyes, it probably looked like Silas was using up a great amount of stamina to kill them all quickly, when in reality, he wasn't. Silas settled into a rhythm, his movements became more fluid. The only worry was his usage of ether, but even that was being kept to an absolute minimum. All the while, his gaze was focused on finding a way out of this. He needed a method to kill the Spider Queen before it could break free. He also wasn't under the illusion that it would just continue to sit idly there as its children continued to die in droves. There was definitely some sort of skill or the like that it could use. However, its constitution was too high for him to kill with his current stats. It has to be poison, then. That's the only way, but I'll need a method to bypass its constitution nonetheless. Beasts at this level have intelligence no weaker than that of humans as well. So if I want to use my telekinesis to trick it with its sensitive hairs, I'll only have one go at it. A second time won't work. He needed an open wound at the very least, or he needed to destroy one of its eyes. But he also couldn't afford to go all in on this tactic either. There was a very real possibility that this Spider Queen would be resistant to his poison. This was a quasi-bronze beast, or a quasi-king beast as the Madness Key called them. He couldn't afford to take it lightly. Scree. Just as Silas was trying to figure out the best course of action, the screech of the spider echoed through the root system. More sand fell from above, and pillars of light fell on the woodland spider queen's abdomen. Runes lit up and all of a sudden its abdomen began to pulse. With every squeeze, another spider was released, but this time their aura made the earlier baby spiders look like, well, babies. Elite Woodland Spider, FFF+. Level, 11. Dash. Physical, 471. Greater than, Strength, 538. Greater than, Constitution, 512. Greater than, Dexterity, 395. Greater than, Speed, 411. Mental, 467. Greater than, Intelligence, 762. Greater than, Wisdom, 273. Greater than, Charisma, 416. Will, 488. Silas' gaze flickered. This was a problem. Even with a distraction, it would be nigh impossible to kill these easily. His strength was now only half of their constitution. The Spider Queen wasn't done even after a dozen pumps. It just kept going, and soon the number of these elite woodland spiders had doubled, and then doubled again. It felt endless, but considering the ridiculous intelligence stats of the Spider Queen, maybe it really could be endless. I can't continue to rest on my back foot. I've observed enough. Silas finally stopped standing in place and burst forward as though he had been shot out of a cannon. The underground space was large, but there was still only 50 meters separating him and the Spider Queen. Caution lit his senses as his wariness shot through the roof. He had no idea if the Spider Queen would have another method of attacking him when he got close, and he quickly found that he was right to be cautious. The Spider Queen unleashed another screech, and an arrow of venom cut through the air toward him. Fast, piercing, lethal. Silas opened his mouth and roared, using less than Arctic Halmatan for the first time in the battle. The arrow froze in place as Silas slid by it, coating his feet with more ice as he accelerated past the leg side of one of the elite spiders before jumping onto the head of another and into the air. Semi-fusion activated, and Silas pulled on Nosphaline's skill mastery, activating less than Glydian a split second. In that moment, it was like he had been using the skill all his life. In a blink, he had appeared high above the Spider Queen, meeting its several eyes with a deathly intent of his own. Chapter 509, Hissing. Bang! The arrow Silas just dodged crashed into the ground. Or rather, into the mesh of roots. The sounds of sizzling and popping only barely managed to reach his ears before Silas' gaze blazed with fiery intent. Less than psychedelic punch, greater than. With every improvement to one kind for me, the visualization of the beast totem also became stronger and more shocking. However, Silas wasn't using the beast totem as his visualization this time. He was using the slow rune. Ice crackled and popped around his fist, his hair dancing wildly as he punched out. His fist seemed to be suppressed by something, almost as though it was trying to move through an icy storm. Veins popped along his forearm, his knuckles becoming covered by an icy sheen as he suddenly broke through that barrier. Bang! The Spider Queen had been completely focused on Silas' fist, ready to act at any moment, all for his fist skill to suddenly vanish from his hand and appear before its eyes in a blink. Etherflow. What this Spider Queen had only learned just now was that the surrounding 100 meters was Silas' range. Although his will wasn't able to exhibit its full strength due to how low his charisma was, that didn't mean there was no change at all. For example, there was probably no one on Earth who could forcefully counter his telekinesis now with a mere surge of ether. Before Silas, even your own body wouldn't be fully under your control. The icy fist aura smashed into an eye of the Spider Queen. A shrill screech echoed, but the sight of a bursting eye didn't come, nor was there any surge of blood and gore. So strong. Silas' pupils constricted. As with every stat, constitution was relative. Not every part of the body would have the same defense, much like how a kick would carry more strength, or a finger would exhibit more dexterity than the body as a whole. The eyes should be one of the weakest parts of the spider's body. It probably could only exhibit about half of the Spider Queen's constitution. And yet, it had come out unscathed. Shuu. The sound of sharp wind howling twitched Silas' ears. His visualization sparked with warning signs of danger as a root deep within the web the Spider Queen was trapped inside shot out. It appeared before Silas in a flash. Stuck in a punching posture, it was truly too difficult for Silas to dodge out of the way now. However, his reaction was quick. Telekinesis coated his body, and less than glide was still active. He pulled on the gluttony seed and his body was suddenly ripped into a twisting motion. His head spun along with his body as he braced his forearms across his chest. The rogue root scraped into his flesh, just barely shy of tearing across the muscle and bone. His forearms managed to divert the root just enough that it didn't pierce into his face, but the assault of the poison that coated it came swift and harsh. Silas was sent flying, barreling down toward a horde of greedy elite spiders. His arms felt as though a scalding hot iron had been pressed against them. In fact, it felt like it was still searing against his skin, rooting itself down into his muscle and toward his bone. He's been poisoned. This should end swiftly, Germian spoke with a glint in his eye. No one else said anything, but it was clear that they were all thinking the same thing. Maybe due to the danger of the situation, Silas had made a truly foolish decision. As for Ragnar, who had experienced Silas' poison immunity before, he still felt the same way. After all, his poison came as an offshoot from a beast that wasn't even worthy of being a lackey to the Spider Queen. The poison of the Spider Queen itself was on a whole other level. The portal is collapsing soon, one of the sylphs, Rylan, looked toward the distance. Before, their plan had been to simply allow it to close. Killing Silas was more important. But now they felt the desire to have their cake and eat it too. If Silas was finished, shouldn't they return? We will stay. Another sylph, Calden, cut Rylan off before he could even make the suggestion. This is something we must see through to the end. No mistakes can be allowed. Everyone fell into silence once more as the portal flickered on its final embers before being forcefully shut. Silas noticed the change immediately, but it was hard for him to pay much mind to it when he was currently falling to his death. The amount of ether it would take to reverse course now wasn't worth it. With his intelligence halved, forcefully activating less than Glidino so he could rebound into the skies would deplete more than he was willing to give up. That was because now he not only had to counter his own weight, but that of the force of the Spider Queen's attack as well. Even so, he remained deathly focused as several venom-formed arrows shot toward him from below. Some of the elite spiders even curled their abdomens, sending out spurts of poisonous roots right at him. Silas opened his mouth and roared, less than Arctic Halmatan causing an echo of clangs to reverberate. The defenses of the skill were too low to face off against so many attacks, but the slight freeze delay was what Silas really needed. Rather than fighting against his downward momentum, he pressed the advantage, pushing his telekinesis to allow him to fall even faster. He shot by the intersection of attacks and landed on the head of an elite spider. The sickening sound of shattering carapace and oozing, meaty flesh filled his ears. This poison is indeed weaker than my own. It's only formed about 38 or so foundations. But the ether backing it is strong, and there's an extra character to it that makes it particularly stubborn. Silas knew that this extra character was the power of quasi-king beasts. When that half-illusory flickering crown appeared above their heads, it was like they had become the ruler of a region and several rules no longer applied to them. This made this poison particularly stubborn. Silas dodged out of the way of an attack, feeling his nerves frying. However, his gaze flashed as what he had been waiting for finally arrived. The sound of hissing filled the skies as dozens of serpentis made their way toward his location. Beacon. Chapter 510, Too Late. There were likely a rare few people on Earth that had the flexibility of thought that Silas did. The moment he realized the kind of situation he was in, he changed his perspective. He didn't worry about finding Lucius for revenge, nor did he have the mind to care about what people were watching from the shadows. Instead, his thoughts were consumed by one drive. Survive. The instant he got the notification about what was happening to him, he activated Beacon. And it was actually because Beacon was activated that less than psychedelic punch could only be used with his slow ice poison rune. Beacon needed to use his beast totem. So while it was active, his beast totem couldn't be used for anything else. But the miraculous thing about Beacon was that the only existences that could sense it was serpentis. As such, whether it was the Spider Queen or the sylphs watching from the sidelines, they didn't realize what he was doing until it was too late. There were many trade-offs to be made in life, and the summoning seemed to only make that more obvious. While it was much harder to gather up ice poison and cast ice poison skills in the middle of this desert, the number of serpentists within a kilometer radius wasn't a small number at all. The hissing had only just begun, but it rose to a fever pitch in the next instant. The woodland spider queen unleashed a shriek as it was infuriated by the invasion into its territory. However, between their fear of the woodland spider queen and their reverence for Scylla's, there was no competition at all. The serpentists flooded in. Starting from just a few dozen, they quickly doubled and then doubled again. Scylla continued to dodge out of the way of the attacks of the elite spiders. As he did, he observed the situation and couldn't help but frown. Many of them are injured. I see. There must be barricades on the outside. But that means, Scylla's gaze flashed with realization. Lucius was just using Ragnar and the sylphs. When he understood this, several things that were odd to him made sense. If the sylphs knew that he had suffered such a terrible demerit, they would be able to guess that he would be trapped in this field dungeon. And if they could guess that, they wouldn't need to put up the number of barricades that would be necessary to harm such a large number of serpents. That could only mean that the plans of Lucius and the sylphs weren't properly aligned. When Scylla came to understand this, he realized that this disjointedness might be a chance for him. The situation on the battlefield changed in that instant. The serpents swarmed towards Scylla's location, and their numbers were only increasing as the barricades they plowed through left open gaps for more of their kind to make their way in. By the time the numbers crossed into the hundreds, even Scylla's was floored by the sheer number. He had several underestimated the number of wildlife hidden away in this root system. But this was also precisely the opportunity he needed. In fact, the punch he had levied at the Spider Queen wasn't nearly as useless as it seemed. While he didn't rupture the eye, that wasn't his main goal. Poison didn't have to enter through an open wound, it could also seep into a vulnerable body part. As someone who once worked with venom for a living, Scylla knew that even breathing in too deeply in the face of the wrong kind could end his life. The genitals, the nose, the mouth, the posterior, they were all vulnerable regions. And of them, the only ones he didn't mention were the eyes. Even if the Spider Queen had the constitution to resist his punch, that didn't mean it had the defenses necessary to stop his ice poison from seeping into its blood system. Scylla leapt back, allowing his horde of serpents to begin an all-out war with the spiders. Scree! The fury of the Spider Queen shook the web system. Scylla's senses had never left it, and he noticed the blue vein pattern running through its eye, slowly crawling its way up. He looked down at his arms, and he seemed to be in the same situation as the Spider Queen. However, that was only because he hadn't had the time to deal with it. Taking advantage of the appearance of the serpentess, he stood still, his gaze blazing. All of a sudden, runes were forcefully expelled from the open wounds in his arms. Though to a layman, it would look as though it was a large amount of violet-green tainted blood. Scylla's body immediately felt lighter as his blood ran down his arms. From any perspective, he looked like a man on his last legs. However, only he knew just how close to victory he was. He flickered and vanished, his body activated less than Cyrobane elevation greater than, and he could feel it churning deeper than ever before. His grasp of blood essence allowed him a far sharper image of what it truly meant to raise his stat limit. With his horde allowing him to ignore the elite spiders, he only had one thought in mind: kill the Spider Queen as quickly as possible. A road of ice appeared as he leapt up. His feet glided along its smooth surface, and a single one of his strides became like four. Semi-fusion activated at the same time, and less than glidewas. Triggered again. While he might not be able to use less than surfing frost and less than chilled wrist at the same time, with semi-fusion, he could use less than surfing frost and less than gliddy simultaneously, with the latter having its load taken by the hibernating Nosfaline. His speed had been suppressed to just 260, but at the moment, he was nearing almost 5 times that. Now's the perfect time. His telekinesis moved, and the hairs by the Spider Queen's damaged eye shifted. The Spider Queen reacted fiercely, snapping her head in a certain direction only to realize nothing was there. By the time she turned back, it was too late. Chapter 511, Lost its mind. Less than psychedelic punch greater than. A pair of golden slit irises appeared behind Scylla's. In that moment, even the Spider Queen shook with fear. Scylla's was descending with over 1000 speed, putting all of that pressure and his power into a single punch. In the last moment, Silas deactivated less than Gliddy and less than surfing frost greater than, diverting all his ether to less than stunning spike greater than. His fist arched back, his body stretching itself thin like a bow before he exploded with all of his power at the same time. He wasn't thinking about doing a small amount of damage. He wanted to shatter the Spider Queen's entire head, he wanted its body to rupture down the middle, for the power of his fist to make it look as though it had imploded, as though a nuclear bomb had been implanted into the depths of its body. Of course, none of that actually happened. But his willing practically forged his fist into a gauntlet larger than his hand, a green glow carrying the weight of the world descending with the momentum of a man enraged. Boom! The eye deformed beneath Silas' fist, and he felt all the tendons in his arms snap at once. Almost like a rubber band that had finally reached its limits, his arm surged with too much power before collapsing in on itself, even bending in the wrong direction. However, from Silas' expression, one could have never guessed. He buried his arm into the eye of the Spider Queen. Although he hadn't been able to make it to its brain, the damage was done. Scree! Silas felt a violent pressure hit him in a wave as the Spider Queen shook off less than stunning spike greater than. He knew that despite the disparity in their wills, the skill was much too low level to hold it for long. He had only wanted to stop it from using a defensive skill at the last moment, and it had worked. What hadn't worked was the fact that the Spider Queen's skill was only paused, not entirely interrupted. It was the first time Silas had even seen such a thing. A wave of pressure collided against him, and like an almighty push, he was sent flying away. However, the sinister glint in his eyes didn't fade in the slightest. That was because as he had been sent flying, he planted something in the eye of the Spider Queen. The Arctic Emperor Cobra's venom sac. He had put a lot of effort into the Arctic Emperor Cobra. Its ice poison was no longer the stock version, but rather an upgraded form of his freeze ice poison rune. There was no doubt that its venom sac had also undergone a qualitative change. And unlike Silas, who was a mere level 0, his Arctic Emperor Cobra had been level 19 and had the powerful ether to back it up. The woodland Spider Queen couldn't shrug it off nearly so easily. Silas landed in a pile of serpents who used their bodies to cushion him. Some of them even died beneath the impact, and yet they seemed more than willing to give their lives to the cause. There were no supremely powerful serpents among them because this was the territory of the Spider Queen. Beasts were highly territorial, so there likely wouldn't be such a serpent anywhere near here. However, what he lacked in quality, Silas' beacon path talent more than made up for in quantity. The elite spiders found themselves being hounded by dozens of serpents each, and it seemed that even though Silas had turned beacon off, the number of serpents was only increasing as they formed a tide to enter battle. Silas stood to his feet, wiping blood off of his lips with his one good remaining arm, his other having been snapped back to its proper form but could still only hang limply. The Spider Queen wreathed and roared, the blue runes along its body only increasing. Silas could practically see its defenses come tumbling down. The venom sac of the Arctic Emperor Cobra wasn't small by any means. Both creatures were just as large as one another, so it was simply impossible for the Spider Queen, who was used to using her poison on others, to deal with it in such a short time. Silas took deep breaths, using these moments of reprieve to try and recover and heal himself. But he was still on high alert. A mixture of his blood and that of the Spider Queen's coated his body, his open wounds stinging. However, he stood tall, watching coldly as the Spider Queen continued to writhe. In the distance, the Sylphs and Ragnar frowned. This change in the situation was completely out of their expectations, and it was also clear that Silas had done something to the woodland Spider Queen that they didn't understand. Never could they have thought that Silas would use poison to deal with a poisonous beast. This might not be a bad thing, Ragnar said as he suddenly noticed something. You want to take action now? That's a possibility, but I think it would be too premature. The Spider Queen isn't so easy to defeat. The only reason it's taking so long to get out of its web is that it doesn't want to destroy it. But if Silas pushes it too far. Ragnar had only just finished speaking when the emotions of the woodland Spider Queen boiled over. Its blood pooled and entered its mouth. Tasting its own blood for the first time, it froze for a moment as though it didn't understand what it was sensing. But when it finally did understand, it completely lost its mind. Its mindless shrieks turned into a skill, and Silas was forced to thicken the ether skin around his head and clamp his palms over his ears. However, because one of his arms was useless, he had no choice but to use a shoulder and a palm instead. Rip. At that moment, the first leg of the Spider Queen tore its way out of the complex net of roots, sending sharp, poisonous projectiles and splinters flying in all directions. Chapter 512, Advantage. Woodland Spider Queen, Level, 25. Physical, 1464. Greater than, Strength, 1710. Greater than, Constitution, 1806. Greater than, Dexterity, 1140. Greater than, Speed, 1200. Mental, 1670. Greater than, Intelligence, 2850. Greater than, Wisdom, 690. Greater than, Charisma, 1462. Will, 994. A flicker appeared above the Woodland Spider Queen's head. Its stats didn't change, that Silas was certain of. However, it was the same oppressive might he had felt from the Arctic Emperor Bear. The effectiveness of the Spider Queen's stats hit a new threshold, one that was hard to put into just a few words. Even without its numbers increasing, the oppression it wrought was deadly. And maybe even more important than that, it seemed to gain a repertoire of new skills. The root system beneath Silas' feet exploded, and he looked down to find an endless abyss beneath his feet. His gaze flickered as his weight was swept out from under him. He realized that the system had screwed him over more than he knew. He was stuck in this region, unable to leave. But now he had just realized that this wasn't just a nest. The entire web was the Spider Queen's attack weapon. Suddenly, the roots around him shot at him from all sides, their barbs scratching against his skin and trying to tear him apart even when he dodged. The roots swallowed him up, and Silas could barely hear the hisses of his horde of snakes before that sound was cut off from him as well. The panic threatened to take hold of his heart before he forcefully pressed it down. He noticed several things. First, the roots were numerous, but their power output was relatively weak. Even with his weakened constitution, they couldn't pierce through him easily. The barbs were only scratching at his skin and leaving shallow cuts. Their real danger was the poison they held. But Silas was relatively unaffected by it. If the Spider Queen could control such a large region and bring real power along with it, she would simply be undefeatable. The second thing he noticed was that he had quickly stopped falling. He had rebounded against a barrier, and if he had to guess, this barrier was what was trapping him within the field dungeon. The Spider Queen had probably wanted him to fall to his death, as the underground was far deeper than he ever expected. But what neither of them could have guessed was that Silas would be saved from such a death by something that was originally a punishment. The Woodland Spider Queen was an intelligent beast. It should know that Silas was capable of flight. But it would also be aware that this flight would only last a short time and took a lot out of him. It had wanted to capitalize on this by beating and battering him until he just outright died. That was because this beast had already begun to fear Silas. It wanted to get rid of him as quickly as possible, eradicate his serpents, and then deal with the poison that was drilling its way through its body. However, it had failed to do so. And the third thing Silas realized was that the Queen couldn't sense him clearly any longer. Before, the Spider Queen was one with its web, so anyone that stepped onto it, it sensed. But now, it had not only broken free, but it had done so forcefully, effectively destroying a large segment of the web. That meant that if Silas found a way back, he would have the advantage of a sneak attack. Silas regained his calm and analyzed all of this in a brief instant. He stood on the barrier, and darkness was all around him. It was impossible to tell how far below things went, but what he could tell was how far he had to go to return upward. He could still see some faint rays of light peeking through the woven tapestry of tree roots. This darkness, it's to my advantage. Heaving deep breaths, Silas' gaze flickered in the darkness before he formulated a plan. Then, he pulled Nosfaline out. Until now, he had been hiding her. That was because he knew that the Woodland Spider Queen wasn't the only danger he had to face. Having another hidden trump card that could jump out and surprise his enemies was for the best. But now, another opportunity had presented itself. He could barely see his own hand in this place. The odds that they could still keep tabs on him were low. He pressed a palm to Nosfaline's chest and ripped the cancer out of her even faster than he had before. The impact of her LV-12 taboo bond path was showing itself. It wasn't even a half-second before Nosphaline's eyes were fluttering, and this time, there was no need to even attempt to heal her. "Can you make it through?" Silas asked. Nosphaline had barely recovered when Silas asked her if she could make it through to the other side. She knew better than to ask Silas questions by now, so she just tried and then shook her head. "Interesting. So if someone enters, they'll be stuck with me. No wonder they haven't tried to impact the battle. But that's fine as well. We have an enemy above. It's already severely injured. You hold it with your charm skills, and I will deal the final blow. Do not show yourself if unnecessary." Silas pulled on his gluttony seed as Nosphaline activated less than glide greater than. They both shot into the air at the same time, weaving through the roots. Nosphaline stopped just underneath the Spider Queen, enough to see its eyes through the gaps in the roots. Silas rounded to its back, his gaze sharp as he patiently waited. The instant Nosphaline's blue eyes flashed, he ripped through the roots, appearing behind the Spider Queen as it went on a rampage, its sharp legs spearing through one serpent after another. It didn't even notice Silas at first, and by the time it felt like something was off, Nosphaline's skill had collided with it. Silas appeared high above it, falling toward its gaping eye wound with menace. Less than Arctic King's domain greater than. Chapter 513, Horrifying. Silas hadn't had the chance to use this skill since the battle started. The distance between himself and the Spider Queen was too large, and he also didn't dare to stay near it for too long. But this time, he needed it. Not for the continuous poison damage, but rather for an effect of the skill that he had mostly ignored just now. His ice poison skills were weaker now because the climate wasn't conducive to its strength. Or more accurately, the ice aspects of his affinity were in very limited supply. By comparison, the amount of poison runes in the surroundings couldn't be any higher. However, if he used less than Arctic King's domain greater than, he would be able to strengthen the ice aspects in the air to the point where he could force his skills beyond the usual tier. When this activated, a blizzard surrounded his body, and his ice poison skills were boosted by several dozen percentage points. Winter's Edge. Blades of snow fluttered around Silas, and his body froze in the air for but a moment before he drew a finger across the air. Less than chilling scythe greater than. The blade light, swirling the sharp protrusions of Winter's edges, shot right into the open wound of the Spider Queen. Silas descended after it, landing on the Queen's head and pushing an arm into her open flesh wound. The spike of pain woke the Spider Queen up, and Silas vaguely heard Nosphaline coughing up a mouthful of blood in all the chaos. If not for the fact he knew she was there, he would have very likely missed her completely. He didn't have the time to mind it. He held onto the Spider Queen's body with fierce determination. When it tried to cast its defensive skill again, he cast less than Arctic Halmatant at the same time. Amplified by his less than Arctic King's domain greater than, it was several fold stronger than it should have been, clashing against the forceful push of the Spider Queen, keeping him in place, and strengthening the spread of the poison even further. It was only now Silas truly understood the power of less than Arctic King's domain greater than. It was one thing when he was already stuck in a land of ice, but where it truly displayed its power was in worlds lost in a thick desert-like mess. Exactly like this one. Scree. The Spider Queen bucked and wreathed, but Silas refused to let go. He stuck his entire arm into the hole in its eye, grabbing onto whatever slimy mess he could. His gaze was sharp and cold, the determination in his eyes not fading for even a moment. Bang! The Spider Queen slammed into the side of its nest, pinning Silas' body along with it. Silas felt practically his whole rib cage shatter at the same time. His bones punctured into his inner organs, and his body felt like it wanted to shut down. He had ended up far more injured than he wanted, but he knew that he didn't have the luxury to rest on his laurels. The next time the Spider Queen flung him away, it wouldn't be so foolish as to let him fall. The lack of attack options was really driving him into a wall as his vision swam and his arm threatened to loosen its grip. His other arm was still useless from the earlier less than psychedelic punch greater than, but that was the least of his worries when he had holes in his lung and liver now. The pain was absolutely excruciating. If the Spider Queen's eye was large enough to crawl into, he would have. Unfortunately, while it was a large reaction, it wasn't quite that large. With a grit of his teeth, he pressed his foot into the back of its abdomen and pushed himself forward. Using the leverage, he pushed his arm deeper into its eye. Then he coated his finger with a sheen of telekinesis and ether skin, pulling up the dregs of what he had left and piercing down and into the soft flesh. He had given it everything he had. The Arctic Emperor Cobra's pouch, his own attacks, Nosphaline's interference, and now it looked like he would be willing to give up even his own arm for a chance. However, in his focus, he didn't notice the abdomen of the Spider Queen suddenly light up again. But this time, it didn't form a new elite spider. A root pierced down from above. Silas barely had the time to register the fact that his luck sent him blaring warning signs when it appeared above his back. He only moved the slightest bit when the root, full of poison, shot through his chest. Silas' gritted teeth gave way to a spurt of blood. The root tried ripping him back, its barbs sticking into his body and trying to rip him apart from the inside out. But with a roar, Silas froze it all, pumping all of his ether out without a thought to conserve it. This was a matter of his life and death, and there was no time to hesitate. He forcefully twisted his body, and the root that pierced through him snapped. Silas' arm went loose, and he was sent flying off the body of the Spider Queen. Blood came from his mouth, so thick and dark that it looked as though it had had all its vitality sucked dry from it. An entire half of Silas' chest was covered by a sheen of ice, the blue veins pumping wildly beneath as it froze his blood over. His vision swam, and he couldn't quite see clearly. He tried to interpret the signals his visualization was sending him, but all he saw was the vague outline of the Spider Queen rushing toward him. At the same time, he saw something even more horrifying. The Spider Queen pierced its leg through one of its elite children, and it turned into green motes of light that looked like twisting vines. These twisting vines surged into the Spider Queen and started to heal it. Chapter 514, Fear. Silas winced as he tried to get up. If not for his horde of serpents, he would have already been overrun by the smaller woodland spiders. However, he knew that he couldn't let the woodland Spider Queen have any more chances to heal. No matter what, he had to get up. No matter what. Hidden in the distance, Ragnar and the sylphs were tense. They had just thought that Silas was dead, but then he came back with a maneuver they couldn't quite understand. But even now, when they should have been relaxing, it still felt as though the air had been completely sucked out of their lungs. This man was dangerous. He was practically fighting such a beast on his own, a quasi-bronze beast, and he was making it suffer. They clenched their weapons, the gazes filled with thankfulness that he should die soon. No matter what, they had to make certain of that. A man who could make it this far without support had to be taken out as quickly as possible. Because the day he managed to build a real faction around himself would likely be the day the rest of them didn't have a chance anymore. Ragnar understood Earth's situation better than most people. He knew that there were other people who were just as dangerous. But those people were hidden experts of the governments, slumbering powerhouses of the families, stowed away trump cards of legacy, ancient races with foundations deeper than any of them could imagine. But if there was another person like Silas, a person without such foundations who had managed to become so dangerous, he couldn't name them. Silas pushed himself up, blood drizzling down his face. He nearly fell, his body lacking the blood needed to stop his head from spinning. It felt like the ground was moving beneath him, and it only made it worse that it was in part. The roots weren't exactly the most solid floor there was. They moved and swayed, shifting and bouncing with his every step. Silas looked ahead, meeting the gaze of the Spider Queen. Or, at least, what was left of it. He could see it. Another person would feel despair right now, but he refused to allow himself to sink into that abyss once again. Instead, he was focused on another thing. Fear. Not coming from himself, but the scent he could feel coming off of the woodland Spider Queen. He could feel it as though it was lingering in the air like the dense fog of dusk. He could feel its inferiority. He could feel the power of being the superior beast. The woodland Spider Queen shuddered as it took a step back. There was something particularly sinister about a Silas with a thick branch sticking out of his chest, iced over as though he couldn't feel it in the slightest. Although his legs wobbled, his gaze itself was firm. His will blazed deep within, the solid light practically boiling over. He was someone who had shattered the glass ceiling of Earth's will. He was someone who refused to allow a mere stat to dictate just how strong his will might or might not be. He was someone who was determined not to die here. Less than astral will fission greater than. Silas sacrificed an entire 1,000 of his will in a single sitting. The woodland spider queen couldn't even feel it. Its eyes were completely locked onto Silas, its fear gripping its heart and its soul. It could feel that a danger was coming, and it knew that that danger was Silas, but it had no ability to fight back against it. At that moment, Silas recalled his experience in the Sylph dungeon. The last will trial used kamikaze astral wills to attack his psyche, but they had been unable to succeed because his will was too strong. Back then, he had the thought of using less than astral will fission as a foundation to do exactly this, but he didn't dare to try for fear of the permanent decrease to his will. But this time, there was no other choice, so he made the right decision without the slightest hesitation. His will came infused with all of his silver-grade ice poison affinity. And it pierced right into the Spider Queen's very soul. Silas didn't move, and neither did the Spider Queen. They stood there, dozens of meters apart, staring at one another seemingly without the slightest intention of moving. The Spider Queen was already close to its last legs. The amount of poison that had been pumped through its body was tremendous. If it was any other beast without a poison affinity, it would have long since collapsed. Although Silas' poison was far stronger than its own, it had the level and ether advantage. The Arctic Emperor Cobra weakened that advantage, but after the Spider Queen activated its kingly aura, it became several times more difficult for it to deeply root itself. The rule-breaking ability of these king beasts was precisely what made them so supremely powerful. Their stats were almost a secondary worry. Unless you could overwhelm them, you would have no chance at all. However, now, Ragnar and the Sylphs could only watch in silence as Silas stared down the Spider Queen, and their hearts quaked as the beast actually took a step back, and then another, before it froze. Then they witnessed something that they would never forget. The Spider Queen, frozen in place, began to slowly ice over. Before, the blue runes were only growing slowly, but all of a sudden, they accelerated, overwhelming its body. Soon, half its body was encased in ice, and then it was over 70% before there was almost nothing at all that wasn't frozen. It tried to open its mouth to echo out with one last mournful cry, but as it was in the process, its maw was the final piece to be frozen solid. The Spider Queen stopped moving. Forever. Field Dungeon of Less Than Woodland Spider Queen cleared. Chapter 515, Plentiful Rewards. Silas heaved long, slow breaths. The aches in his body were practically screaming at him, trying to get him to collapse to the ground, but he was well aware that things wouldn't end so simply. Rewards. Greater than Woodland Spider Den. Greater than Woodland Poison Lance Treasure. Greater than Woodland Spider Queen Slayer Title. Greater than Woodland Territory Key Treasure. Greater than Woodland Web Fortress. The rewards were plentiful, and even without looking into them too deeply, Silas had a feeling that the grades were also exceptionally high. He likewise saw many things that he had never seen before. For example, what was a fortress? It was the first category of its kind that he had seen. And also, what was a territory key? The evergreen territory was, well, a territory. Could it be that defeating this woodland spider gave him the rights to a territory? But where was this territory? Could it be that that was the true location that this part of Earth was meant to connect to on the ether plane? If that was the case, would it be as barren, dry, and hot as this land? If that was the case, then it might not be so great to gain this reward. Woodland Territory Key, Unranked Treasure. Bring this key to the Woodland Territory in exchange for ownership of the land. It seemed that his guesses were correct, but it couldn't be all bad. An entire multi-quest was necessary to take charge of the Evergreen Territory, but with this key he would just have to show up. Though, he had risked his life just to get it. Most others would have died long ago. Woodland Web, Silver, Fortress. Protect your city with the spirit of the Woodland Spider Queen. The description was vague and there didn't seem to be much else to it, but after asking the Madness Key, Silas realized why that was. He wasn't a city lord, so there were certain breakdowns he couldn't see. A fortress was a treasure that could be applied to a city stele to give it certain upgrades. In this case, the Woodland Web would replace the city walls, overhaul the military encampment, and provide certain immunities and boosts to the cities and soldiers. A military encampment was a building that could be built through the city stele, and it was often one of the required upgrades for a city stele to evolve. The city wall was the same. However, with a fortress applied, this expense could be ignored. The city wall itself was often one of the greatest expenses a city lord would have to incur, but with a fortress, so long as it was of high enough grade, it would evolve naturally so long as the other upgrade requirements were met. The military encampment was what could decide how well a soldier was trained and what natural abilities they would have. Normally, the easiest way to upgrade a soldier was by upgrading the military encampment or outfitting it with class stels. But a fortress could do this naturally. Silas couldn't see the details, but the woodland web probably gave some sort of basic poison immunity and might even allow the soldiers that were summoned to have decent poison affinity as well. If these soldiers were paired with the woodland spider den, then a city would be able to create a whole cavalry of poison masters. It would truly be a unique combination. But it would be tough to justify. Chaosheir already had to deal with issues with her citizens related to the rotten wolves. The spawned people of cities couldn't just be treated like normal NPCs, and you had to consider things other than just raw power output. Poison and spiders were certainly two things that people might not take too kindly to. Woodland Poison Lance, Silver, Treasure. Level 1. Plus 300 Strength. Ability, Pierce, Erode. Strength is doubly as effective. Destroy structural integrity of ether. Durability, 50-50. The initial stats weren't as overwhelming as the basilisk skin armor, but the potential effects of Erode spoke for themselves. Between the piercing power, and the fact that an opponent's ether skin would practically shatter under the effects of Erode, it was a truly powerful weapon. It was too bad its uses had little to nothing to do with Silas. He couldn't use it as much. It was particularly heavy, and it wasn't the sort of nimble weapon that was ideal for his telekinesis. But, it would be a nice to-have trump card along with his heavy, chain stone. Woodland Spider Den, FFF+. Level, 25. Spawn rate, 3. Mutation rate, 0.1. The spawn rate of the den shocked Silas once more. To spawn 3 creatures that powerful a day was ridiculous, but the fact the mutation rate was 0.1 was even crazier. That meant for every 10 woodland spiders formed, one of them would be a mutation. A mutation might not necessarily mean that it would be stronger, it was also possible that it could be weaker. However, that many chances at a mutation could mean that one of the woodland spiders that spawned just might come out as strong as the woodland spider queen. For the first time, Silas actually felt like the danger of this field dungeon was actually worth it. Especially since he was fairly certain that this wasn't all he would gain. Now, it was just a matter of whether or not he would actually survive. He had quickly scanned the treasures not because he had the leisure to do so, but precisely because he didn't have any time. He knew that the moment the barriers of the field dungeon collapsed, he would have more enemies on the way. He had looked through the treasures in hopes that he would find something that could boost his odds of survival right now, but unfortunately he didn't find any such smoking gun. But time waited for no man. He could already sense the movement, and soon enough, his enemies began to appear. There were only 2, and both of them were sylphs. Silas' eyes couldn't help but narrow when he saw this. There were definitely more of them. It was just a question of where they were. He realized what the answer was immediately, and a long arm formed of green aura shot toward them. Chapter 516, Sleight of Hand. The sylphs braced themselves for an attack, only for the arm to suddenly change directions and touch the frozen corpse of the woodland spider queen. At the same time, Silas' beacon activated once again, agitating what remained of the spiders and calling in more. He couldn't give them any true commands, but they knew enough to know exactly who it was that he wanted to target. The swarm of serpents rushed toward the sylphs as the woodland spider queen disappeared into Silas' madness key. As for Silas himself, he had already turned to run, a burning pain in his chest. There were only 2 possibilities as to why the others hadn't shown up yet. The first was that they wanted to bait him and spring yet another trap. The second was that they were setting up an area defense around him, trying to create an inescapable net that he would be hard-pressed to fight his way out of. Especially in his current state. He had already deduced that Lucius and Ragnar, though they seemed to have the same goal of killing him, weren't actually working together. That meant that this group wouldn't have known that he would be trapped in this field dungeon, which also meant that they would have had to set up a separate set of defenses to force him to keep fighting the Spider Queen. But by extension of that, thanks to his beacon path talent, those defenses had more or less been shredded apart, so they would have no choice but to set up new ones or rely on another contingency plan. If he was lucky, they had only just started now. If he was unlucky, well, he really hoped that he had suffered enough for the system to leave him alone for a bit, or else he might well and truly be screwed. His speed was already cut in half by the warrant placed on him, and his injuries only took another major cut out of it. Luckily, while they had to be careful weaving in and out of these paths, he did not. After all, this entire web was a poisonous hell trap, while to him he was practically immune. Well, he was immune for as long as his beaten and ragged body could hold up. Beacon lit deep within his soul, and he called for more help on top of what he had already received. However, he was quickly running out of steam. With a quick check to his status page, he realized that his will was actually somehow still at 1999. However, he could feel a great fatigue coming from his mind as though its elasticity was really being pushed to the limit. The use of beacon was a huge weight on his mind, but it was something he could normally easily withstand. But if his continuous use of rune soul was stacked on top of that, it was a miracle that he hadn't passed out already. Calden and Rylan were hot on Scylla's tail. They were caught off guard by the sudden change, not expecting such a prompt decision from Scylla's. But it was only a moment before they were a mere meter or so behind him, ready to reach out and grab him. Scylla's would have cursed if he had the mind to. At a time like this, one more use of his planar convergence gate would have been a miracle sent from above. Unfortunately, he had already used them all up. The timer on his fusion path talent was up, but now his body was too heavily injured to even use it. He felt a hand swipe at him from behind. He tried to activate less than Cyrobane elevation greater than, only to realize that he simply didn't have enough ether. He had pushed out everything he had in that battle, and he was running on fumes. The only thing he could do was dive to the side to avoid a grab, but the gash cut across his back deep enough that even the ice he had used to protect his pierced side fragmented. Scylla's coughed up a mouthful of blood, a deep fury hidden in his eyes. He truly hated this feeling, more than he could describe in just a few words. The worst of it was that even if he managed to find the miracle waiting to give him a path of survival, this likely wouldn't be the last time in his life that he would have to deal with such a situation. How far would he have to run? How much blood would he have to shed? How much pain would he have to experience before he could finally walk through this universe without a single hint of fear? His waning will suddenly sparked and flared with life. Title evolved. Title sequence Shake of the Die has changed. Surge of the Die Sleight of Hand. The odds shift ever against you, but who cares for odds when you have will? When entering heavily injured status or facing off against 10 or more enemies, decrease enemy stats by 20%. Note: the stronger your will, the lower the requirements. The moment Scylla saw the title change, he remembered that he was actually in the middle of a title sequence for Surge of the Die, but the requirements for the next title were tall. He didn't think that it would mutate before he even got a chance to complete it. At the same time he saw this title, he reacted on instinct. He used semi-fusion and activated the Basilisk King's less than voice of a king's kill at the same time. The synergy between his title and skill was forced when his extricate was pushed into the picture. A subconscious understanding of blood essence created a unique resonance that he couldn't quite put his finger on and simply didn't have the time to. At that moment, Calden and Rylan felt their bodies shiver as though they had been stripped of all their clothes, just in time for a heavy stone to swing down from above. Chapter 517, Only the Beginning. Splat. It was a grotesque, wet noise, one so resonating that the two sylphs might have even heard it from the afterlife. They had both thought that they had taken Scylla's more than seriously enough, but neither could have possibly imagined that they would actually die like this. But there was no medicine for regret, and even if there was one, they weren't alive to take it. Scylla's coughed up another mouthful of blood as he slowly stood, but there was the very same calmness to him. Even though that flame of rage was still flickering deep within his eyes, he was starting to understand more and more what this world needed from him. It was still the same two words: be strong. But for some reason, every time he survived a situation like this one, his understanding of those words would warp, ripple, and change as though it was becoming more tangible in a way that was hard to explain. He reached up a hand and grabbed the branch that was ripping through his lung. Accumulating what small bits of ice poison he had left, he poured it all in. He was hesitant to do this earlier because he knew what it would come with. But there were some things that he could only face head-on. And right now, there was a surging confidence rolling through him. Maybe it was foolhardy. Maybe it was him overestimating himself and the danger of the world. And yet, his will still felt so tangible coursing through him. He had stepped through a threshold that few ever would, and somehow, though his will seemed to not have changed, everything had changed at the same time. Intangible will, flexible will, burning will, tangible will, they were all just stepping stones. Neither was as real or formulaic as rune mastery, and two people who had both had burning will might have vastly different outcomes and strengths assigned to them. Will was one of the most enigmatic stats that the system tracked. In fact, the truth was that before this current iteration of the system, will was never something that was tracked because it was simply too difficult to. Scylla's trouble with telekinesis and figuring out his quirks wasn't the only one of its kind. Many had faced the same struggles, and at best, the will stat of the system could only be a general outline of your progress. It was no wonder why even those so-called stat debuffs couldn't change the number on his stat screen. But why was all of this so important now? It was because Scylla's had sensed something very particular when his title evolved just now. His will had taken a step beyond a threshold, but it wasn't the threshold itself that was so amazing. It was instead what it reminded him of. A progenitor flame. Was it truly one? No, of course not. Scylla's had felt the real thing before, and the gap between his flickering flame of a will and a real progenitor flame was worse than night and day. It might as well be like comparing the radius of a star and its size to a moon that could only reflect its light. However, the slight similarities enlightened him to something important. His will wasn't meant to follow a designed, preordained structure like his rune mastery was. It was meant to forge its own path toward indomitability, a path that would be decided by his own hands, built on a foundation of his blood and flesh. Scylla's wouldn't realize for a while just how shocking it was for him to make such a revelation so early on, especially not without the guidance of a teacher or even a hint from the Madness Key. In fact, even if he were to ask the Madness Key, he would just end up stumbling into another taboo. But one thing was for certain. This greed seed couldn't hope to control him. Scylla's hold on the branch in his body tightened, and the wood suddenly shattered into a great number of pieces, leaving a gaping wound in his chest. But even as he sensed his other enemies closing in, he only waved a hand and pulled on the greed seed. The bloody remains of Calden and Ryland convulsed before their blood essence was taken into his body. A pulsing vitality ripped through him, and his injuries, in large part also thanks to his dual-class constitution that handled this sudden influx of energy far better than his original body could have, began to close at a speed visible to the naked eye. And, of course, his LV-12 taboo bond had something to say about all of this as well. Scylla's finally knew what it was that had been missing from the Arctic Emperor Cobra's body. Grin had stripped it of its blood essence. The reason this didn't affect the beast transmutation pill was that the beast skin only worked on surface-level genes, pretty much wasting the rest of the product. It made no difference whether the blood essence was there or not. But now that Scylla's not only understood what the greed seed could do, he was on a level that Grin wouldn't even be able to look up to. Greed had days and still didn't manage to fully absorb the Arctic Emperor Cobra's blood essence. When Scylla's met him for a second time, the man still hadn't recovered his full stats. But between his dual-class constitution, the fact he didn't need to use a medium like Grin's blade, and the fact Extricate gave him a subconscious comprehension of blood essence and how it worked in his body, Scylla's had done what Grin couldn't do in days in a matter of a few dozen seconds. Not just once, but twice over. The moment he began to use the greed seed, he could sense an attack on his mind, but it was rebuffed so easily it might as well have not been there at all. This is only the beginning. The more I strengthen it, the stronger that mental attack will become. But it doesn't matter, you won't be able to outpace my will. Scylla's looked up as his complexion slowly became more rosy. There in the distance, Nosfaline came closer, holding several bloody hands in her supposedly delicate fingers while a drizzle of blood dribbled down the corner of her cherry lips. Chapter 518, Down. Tar. Nosfaline let the heads drop to the floor of roots. Her own gaze was flickering with surprise as she watched Scylla's chest close before her eyes. She couldn't quite understand how anyone could heal so fast. Even the top-graded healing elixirs wouldn't be so great. For it to be so effective, it would have to at least be an E-grade elixir. But the problem with them was that if an F-grade existence took them, they would explode and die. That meant it would not only have to be an E-grade elixir, but it would also need to be an exceptionally high-graded one, maybe one so highly graded that even D-grade existences might fight over it. Only an E-grade elixir that was so great could both have the power and gentleness necessary to be so effective. Having this sort of context, it was no wonder Nosfaline was so shocked. Of course, she had no idea how close to the truth she was. The sylphs that came down to Earth had an odd lock on their bodies. Every time Scylla's tried to absorb their genes, the system didn't recognize them, and even extricate didn't seem to work. Scylla still didn't quite understand why this was, and unfortunately, their methods were taboo, so the madness key couldn't give him the answer he needed. But what was certain was that the strength the sylphs displayed now was only a fraction of their real strength. Although it might not be as exaggerated as them being E-grade powerhouses, Scylla's wouldn't be surprised if they were close. If by chance they were E-grade powerhouses, it would explain why even extricate didn't work on them. After all, extricate was only designed to be used against F-grade existences. But regardless, the blood essence he took from them was certainly not normal by any means. That was because even if they weren't E-grade existences, they were part of an E-grade race, which naturally made their blood essence a level higher than anything Earth had to offer right now. It could be said that of all the people on Earth he could use to replenish himself, these two were among the best. Their leader got away, Scylla asked, ignoring Nosfaline's shock. The more enigmatic she thought he was, the less likely it would be for her to turn on him. It wasn't lost on him that he didn't have full control of her when she wasn't one of his contracts. And now the cancer gene was heavily damaged, so he might only be able to use it once or twice more. So until he found a way to make her a permanent serpentess, he would have to make himself the largest shadow in her mind. I'm not sure who their leader is, Nosfaline said with a shake of her head. Scylla's eyes narrowed. Her response meant that she hadn't seen Ragnar slip away, otherwise, she would have understood what he meant. Nosfaline had come back with 5 heads, 2 of which came from Germain and Brit, while the other 3 were sylphs. Judging by the looks on their faces, she had caught at least the sylphs off guard. He's smart. Scylla knew that none of the heirs were simple characters. Ragnar had proven that several times, and he had suffered enough at Lucius' hand by now to understand it even more intimately. But he didn't expect Ragnar to manage to slip away. No. Scylla's gaze flashed as he realized something. He had planned on healing up some more, but it seemed that he wouldn't have the time. Let's go. He should be close by. Nosfaline was surprised again, but she didn't question it. She had already seen that Scylla's brain simply didn't work like a normal person's did. Even if she had access to the same information, it would probably take her several times longer to reach the same conclusion. What surprised her even more than Scylla's words, though, was the fact that instead of making his way out of this hellhole, he was going in deeper. Literally, Scylla began opening up a path beneath them, ripping through the roots and beginning to descend downward. How's your immunity to the poison? Scylla asked. I should be okay with my ether skin active. Scylla nodded. Nosfaline's intelligence was high, so her reserves of ether would be equally as high. With the help of the armor he had given her and the upgrades they had already fed it with, her constitution wouldn't be too bad either. She should be fine. As for himself, he wasn't back to 100% yet. The blood essence could help his physical stats, but did nothing to change the state of his mind or his ether. While his body was soaking up the blood essence, he also couldn't divert his attention to other things like casting skills because he had to both be wary of the greed seed and be mindful of his control over the powerful blood essence. That said, use this, pick up any snake corpses you see along the way and convert them to pills for me. He had another method of replenishing his ether quickly. Nosfaline obliged as Scylla picked his way forward. It was best he do the heavy lifting on this front, or else no matter how strong Nosfaline's ether, she would eventually hit her limit due to the accumulated damage and corrosion. Scylla began swallowing the pills Nosfaline handed him one after another. The snakes might be weak, but there were many of them, and most had at least part poison affinity that made them more useful to him than not. Although it wasn't the perfect ice poison affinity that would help him best, it was better than nothing. By the time he swallowed the sixth one, his ether had replenished by 30%, and he was closing in on refining the rest of the blood essence. However, it was also around then that their efforts to dig deeper came to an end. There really is something down here. Chapter 519, The Silas hung from the last vestiges of the web of tree roots, his gaze flickering. There was nothing but a fall to darkness beneath him, but his visualization was also not obstructed by the dense web system either. Thanks to that, he could see a full 100 meters below. Or, rather, what was effectively 15 meters or so. And that was enough to notice that there was an abandoned city beneath him, just as expected. Of course, Silas couldn't have been certain of this. He wasn't an oracle who could see the future. But he had had his guesses. The first oddity was the fact he had almost fallen into this abyss before. The Spider Queen had tried to drop him down here, and if not for the barrier of the field dungeon keeping him in, the plan just might have succeeded. But that was only one part. It truly was odd that there was a root system like this built so high above the true ground, but that could easily be explained away by the existence of the Spider Queen. What couldn't be explained away so easily were Ragnar's odd decisions. Why was he so willing to give up his city for the sake of taking him down? It made sense for Lucius to make such a sacrifice, but had he really been such a thorn to Ragnar? He shouldn't even really know who he was. Even if he had figured it out, their interactions were too few and he shouldn't have built up such a hatred for him. There was a chance that it was related to his partnership with the Sylphs, but that would only make sense if Ragnar was stupid. After all, Silas had already killed the best trump card the Sylphs had in the Evergreen territory. And he had yet to confirm if the other two system cities were under their control or not. There was a very real possibility that the only foundation the Sylphs and Ragnar both had left in the Evergreen territory was Ragnar's city. So why abandon it? Even more shocking than that, they should know that Silas had failed the Evergreen multi-quest. That meant that they should have a wide open door to take advantage of. So why were they eager to kill him to the point of allowing the portal to Evergreen to close on them? Was his life really that important to them? There were only two possible explanations. Either the relationship between Ragnar and the Sylphs was built on more than just mutual benefits. Highly unlikely. Or, the group had found something else to rely on. And clearly, the answer to that was 2. A 15-meter fall. We can manage. Silas rocked his body and then, with a sway, he let himself fall down after signaling to Nosfaline to be as quiet as possible. Nosfaline obliged, and realizing this wasn't the right time to use ether, she allowed herself to drop down in the direction of Silas. Silas realized that Nosfaline was going to land awkwardly, so he caught her before she slipped off the building they landed on. It made him realize his visualization wasn't nearly as large as his own. He had already guessed as much, but it was only 15 meters. Could her visualization really be weaker than that? There wasn't much time to mind it all, so he began to scan the region. The first thing he realized was that this place had an extreme fascination with scorpions. The artifacts left behind by whoever once lived here, whether that be the gods they worshipped or the bowls they ate from, all seemed to incorporate scorpions in one way or another. It wasn't much of a surprise that Silas would think of Ragnar and his tattoos when he saw all of this. Could this be where Ragnar had gotten his class from? Silas didn't really have much of a luxury to consider what his second class would be, especially with the time crunch of his first still looming over his head. He was closing in on just about 7 months left to complete all the legs of his chain quest, or else there would be hell to pay. Plus, he had gained so many benefits from the dual class constitution even without a second class to pair it with, so he wasn't all that obsessed. But now that he had run into such a situation, he couldn't help but be curious. His visualization flared outward and he began to check things over one by one. But he didn't find Ragnar immediately like he expected. It seemed that this underground village was far larger than he knew. It was more like a true city. He hopped down from the building quietly, and Nosfaline followed much more nimbly this time. Judging by the general flow of the city, if there are important regions, it'll probably be in that direction. He set off, still remaining cautious. If Ragnar had great gains from this place, this would obviously be his home turf. Silas might be eager to kill him to be rid of one more annoyance in his life, but he couldn't be too careless or else he might end up being counter-killed. It wasn't long before Silas and Nosfaline reached the core of this forgotten city. Though, that was mostly because of their stats. They must have had to travel what was easily tens of kilometers. It was no wonder they had managed to benefit from this place without being worried about the influence of the spider Queen. However, this made things tricky. There was no guarantee that Ragnar could come to the center of the city like this. He could be hiding anywhere, and it would be practically impossible to find him. All of their sneaking around was meaningless at this point, but it was still best to conserve their ether since there was no longer a portal in the region. Given enough time, this piece of earth would become Etherbarren again. As Silas was trying to understand what it was he was looking at in the darkness, Nosfaline suddenly spoke through gritted teeth. The Dogons. Chapter 520, The Dogons. The Dogons. The simple words were quick to catch Silas' attention. This is a lost city of the Dogons. Almost certainly, Nosfaline replied, trying to keep her cool. How do you know? I didn't at first. There is definitely more than one primitive race of Earth that worshipped idols like this. As she spoke, the gaze was focused on the shadowy outline of the scorpion god before them. He had the head of a human, the carapace and tail of a scorpion on his back, and 6 arms. Standing at over 10 meters tall, he looked to the skies as though he wanted to challenge the sun. However, there's only one race I know of that had a fondness for fusing the likeness of humanoids with the gods. They believed it made them closer to the gods. Less arrogant races believed that the gods made them in the image of themselves and granted them free will to worship them. The Dogons believed the opposite. They believed that it was their duty to bring themselves closer to the image of the gods as the ultimate sign of respect. Silas nodded slowly, but this still wasn't enough to confirm for certain, especially since she had been in captivity all her life and couldn't have possibly had a chance to see the Dogons before in any form. Unless, of course, the Dogons were in captivity with her. But if that was the case, she would have certainly mentioned it already, especially with how many times he had questioned her about certain things. In that case, how do you think someone might go about benefiting from a place like this one? Silas asked. Ragnar almost certainly obtained something from this place, and he had also found that it had enough potential to bet his future on, and yet Silas had yet to find anything special here. There was no dungeon entrance, no quest to trigger, there didn't seem to be anything of value at all. You think the leader gained something from here? I believe so. He had an ability related to tattoos. He activated them to form an illusory armor over his body that could both be used to bolster his attack and defense. Nosfaline's brows shot up. That's the unique gene ability of the Dogons. They are born with rune flesh naturally because of it, and they etch runes in the form of tattoos across their bodies to increase their strength. It's an extremely powerful ability. Silas raised an eyebrow. The unique gene allows them to comprehend rune flesh. That's it. Nosfaline gave Silas an odd look. It didn't seem like this master of hers understood just how rare rune flesh was. The vast majority of people would never cross into this 4th level. To have a race that was naturally born at that state gave them an enormous advantage that couldn't be explained in just a few words. The Dogons were far from a barbarian race. Although they looked the part, it was ironically because of their intelligence that it was possible. That said, no, that isn't the only ability of their unique gene. Technically, the unique gene is a very high level of flesh manipulation. It gives them the ability to recover quicker, which also tends to translate to very high physical stats. But most importantly, they can turn over their cells at an exceptional rate. So, if they have a rune etching on their bodies that is no longer useful to them, they can heal from it and replace it with another. They've even created patches that they can use in battle to quickly swap methods. If you ever battle a Dogon, you have to be careful. Because in one moment, you could have gotten used to their attack patterns before they all of a sudden became a completely different combatant before your eyes. Many of my people have died due to their tricks. Silas listened intently, taking note of everything he could. No one would know someone better than their enemies. From the way it sounded, the Clipsians had been in combat with the Dogons for a long while. They likely knew one another very well. The unique gene of Siren's call. But I'll hold off from asking about the Clipsians. She might be willing to tell me everything about the Dogons because she hates them, but it could cause problems if she realized I wanted to know the weaknesses of her race as well. He still hadn't forgotten how those 3 Clipsians had appeared for Nosfaline. It was clear that their camaraderie couldn't be underestimated, even if they had given up on her in the end. Then what are their weaknesses? He asked. It depends on the Dogon you're facing. Most of them have limits, and not all of them are created equal. Most Dogons can only take on 2 or 3 rune etchings at a time. They also tend to run out of ether and mental capacity quickly because of the strain using their runes puts on them, so they'll focus on using their pure physical capabilities for as long as they can get away with it. The most dangerous Dogons, though, are the bone Dogons. If you ever run across a Dogon with bone piercing through their nose or ears, be extremely careful. These are the most powerful of them, and their rune flesh is high-graded enough to rune etch directly into their bone, making them several times more powerful. If you run into a Dogon with odd bone growths coming out of them, however, Nosfaline gave Silas a heavy and somber look. Run the other way. Silas didn't reply to this warning. His head turned and looked up at the statue, and he felt he had pieced together what Ragnar gained from this place. He reached a hand forward and passed a palm across the statue. As expected. The runes, they were here. There was no treasure to find because the city itself was the treasure. A treasure trove of knowledge. Chapter 521, The Treasure. Even before the summoning, Silas' memory was on a completely different level compared to others. With his wisdom increasing to its current point, it was only more exaggerated. He could remember the exact configuration of the tattoos on Ragnar's body, even the ones not readily visible through his clothing. That was because when he almost killed Ragnar through the scorned wraps, he had sensed the clear fluctuation of the tattoos, or rather, what Nosfaline called rune etchings. Because of that, even in the darkness, he had been able to feel some of the same fluctuations coming from this statue. When he felt them with his palms, he was even more certain of the similarities. He noticed that Ragnar had made mistakes in several locations, and it shocked him that he was actually able to get his tattoos to work with so many flaws built up over them. Maybe it was even a good thing for him that he had made so many mistakes. If the tattoos were as powerful as they should be, it was hard to say if Ragnar's body could even withstand them. Looking at them now, Silas even began to wonder if he could withstand them. This must be what Nosfaline was talking about. Being able to use rune flesh was one thing, but being capable of actually withstanding the power of the runes was another. Some of the runes on this statue only had 20 or so foundations, which was manageable enough. But if one looked deeper, many of the runes came together to form a network. By the time you looked at the whole picture, you were gazing at a manuscript that required thousands of foundations. To put this into perspective, Silas freeze and slow ice poison runes were already enough to overwhelm the affinity of the Spider Queen. If not for his weakness in ether, he could have killed the Spider Queen in a few minutes at worst. Yet, they only had a little over 50 foundations each. What sort of concept was it to be 2 orders of magnitude beyond that? In Silas' opinion, even his dual-class constitution couldn't bridge the gap he would need to accomplish this. Suddenly, something sparked in his mind as he made a connection. You said that the Dogons likely received help to accelerate their progress. Nosfaline didn't expect Silas to suddenly start talking and was taken aback. But she replied quite quickly. That's the only way they could have replaced us as the Overlord race after just one summoning. Logically speaking, we should have been the Overlord race of both the second and third summonings, but they took over the latter. Did your elders ever tell you why they thought that? We didn't know any specifics, she replied after a while. Honestly, she was a bit embarrassed. She accepted everything her elders told her without hesitation, but she was also a grown woman now. How could she not understand the hatred and animosity of her people and what kind of biases that would cause in them? It made her wonder if Silas had noticed something contradictory about her statements. She really shouldn't speak about unverified matters like they were facts. Luckily, Silas' next words made her calm. Have you ever seen a rune system this complex? Nosfaline blinked. She didn't know how to answer. Silas looked over at her with a frown. Do you not have rune enlightenment? I do, but I can't see anything right now. Silas frowned. What do you mean you can't see anything? It's too dark. Use your visualization. Visualization. You mean sixth sense. I can't use that to observe runes, not unless I have runes so. The realization overcame Nosfaline, and she looked at Silas like she was looking at a monster. Her lips were slightly parted, and she didn't know what to say. She had been around for long enough to learn several things about this world. Like the fact the summoning only began less than a year ago. How was it possible for anyone to master Rune Soul that quickly? Seeing her reaction, Silas too understood the disconnect. Use your hands and see what you can make out. Nosfaline was starting to get more and more embarrassed as their interactions went on. Her elders had always said she was one of the best geniuses of their race, and if they were still the Overlord race, she would have a chance to unlock the progenitor path. Yet, why was it that she felt she couldn't compare to a man her people only referred to as cavemen and apes? She did as Silas described, but she was having a hard time. Even the blind needed to be taught how to read Braille, and that was a language specifically designed to be easier to feel out. How could she be expected to piece together the complexities of the runes with just the feel? I can't do it, she finally admitted. Silas fell into silence, but he wasn't really thinking about Nosfaline. He was still focused on these runes as though he was trying to piece something together. Suddenly, he remembered Nosfaline was by his side and spoke again. This statue, from what I've seen, is broken into 3 layers. The first foundational layer is formed from runes with 20 or so foundations. There are 68 for the limbs and 32 more just for the torso alone. Between it all, there are probably around 2,300 or so foundations. The second layer is a linkage between them that's formed of at least that many foundations on its own. And then on top of that, there's a mesh layered over the top that combines with the rest to form a grand total of over 9,000 foundations. Silas didn't seem to notice that the more he spoke, the more frozen Nosfaline seemed to become. It wasn't just the shock of such an intricate array of runes. But how was it even possible for someone to analyze them all so fast? Even figuring out the exact number of strokes and foundations in one rune should take dozens of minutes even for one as simple as just 20 foundations. How did his brain work? Chapter 522, Uneasy. Nosfaline was in too much of a daze to answer properly. It was only after she felt Silas' gaze on her that she responded. She shook her head, stabilizing her mental state. I can't say for certain, but what I do know is that F-grade runes won't have more than 100 foundations and E-grade ones won't have more than 1,000. To be approaching 10,000, it would have to be a nearly D-grade rune. But, the way you described it, it's hard to say if it's really a D-grade rune. As talented as you clearly are, analyzing a D-grade rune would cause your soul to burst apart, that I'm certain of. Silas didn't disagree with her, he wasn't so arrogant. Maybe he had analyzed it wrongly. It's possible. Nosfaline started somewhat hesitantly. I can't say for certain, but there are many rune disciplines. I've heard of connecting runes like this, they call them rune networks. It's a method of using many weaker runes to mimic the effects of a stronger rune. The problem is that I've never heard of one being so complex. Nosfaline gritted her teeth, one part due to the frustration of her hesitancy when facing Silas, and another part due to the fact that it was getting clearer by the second that the Dogons really had received outside help. There was no way they had managed to create these themselves. Silas fell into silence before he spoke out a theory of his. Could it be simplified, then? You want to weaken it? No, I mean that maybe this statue is a simplified D-grade rune. If I was a higher existence and I wanted to help a lower existence accelerate the growth, I would need to use methods that gave immediate benefits and long-term benefits. With this statue here, on the one hand, it's very clearly beneficial in the short term. But what if it also helps lay a foundation that could help you comprehend higher grade runes? It dawned on Silas that this just might be a more robust version of what he had already seen before. The first time he analyzed a rune without any sort of foundational understanding, hadn't he done exactly what this mesh, rune etching, armor type, rune network was doing? He had broken down the original ice poison rune into many pieces, designating what each piece did one by one. It was only after that he learned of strokes, foundations, and things of the like. Here, it seemed to be the same thing, just on a completely different scale. Nosfaline's eyes widened. Yes, That's exactly how my elders taught me simpler runes. But if that's true, it would mean that the help the Dogons received had to come from someone with not just an understanding of D-grade runes, but a deep one. Nosfaline clenched her teeth. Rune masters, even at the F grade, were rare and highly sought after. She couldn't even imagine how powerful a D-grade rune master would be, let alone one that could distill the teachings of a D-grade rune into pieces that F-grade existences could comprehend and digest. But there was something else they were both intelligent enough to understand but didn't dare to say aloud. It was one thing for someone to be skilled enough to do this. But it was another matter entirely for them to be so casual about it. This statue had no protections, it was available for everyone to experience, and it was only one of its kind. It was more likely than not that every hidden Dogon city across Earth had at least one of these statues, along with an unknown number of lesser statues laying around. This sort of casual dissemination of something they saw as so valuable could only mean one thing. This enemy of theirs didn't see these teachings as nearly so valuable. It was possible that this existence, then, was even beyond the D grade. But the shadow of even the E grade was so large and looming that it was hard for them to even fathom, let alone the D grade. Imagining something or someone above that. It did them no good whatsoever. Silas had already tossed it to the back of his mind. Instead of trying to study the statue here, he instead began trying to find a way to take it away. Over the course of his journey, he had learned many things in regard to spatial treasures. The fact they had limits to the kind of things they could store was well known to him now, and it made the value of the madness key around his neck all the more potent even if the sheer size of its capacity was ignored. This statue was certainly a treasure of high order. Although it seemed like a simple carving, Silas could feel a clear power radiating from it. If it was placed into a normal spatial device, that device would definitely be torn to pieces. Silas wasn't worried about the madness key. What he was worried about, though, was finding a method of digging this statue out of the ground. That could potentially be tricky depending on a few factors. However, he had underestimated the carelessness of the Dogon's benefactor. Whoever they were, they clearly didn't care about their statue ever corroding or being displaced. The statue wasn't even nailed into the ground. There were only two reasons Ragnar hadn't taken it away. The first was because he didn't have a spatial device like the madness key, and the second was that the statue was far too heavy. For normal people without telekinesis, taking things into a spatial device was a troublesome effort of manipulating their will into an intent that covered the entire object and contact. But for those with telekinesis, whoosh! An odd vacuum formed in the region after the statue vanished into the madness key. It was as though a hole had been left in the world and the ground beneath them destabilized. An uneasy feeling took hold of Silas. Chapter 523, Exact Requirements. Silas stood in silence for a long while as the odd vacuum slowly settled down. However, it only took him a moment to realize something. He was already involved in something much more dangerous. The uneasy feeling was coming from the fact he felt that someone was trying to observe him. However, that feeling was much less sinister and oppressive than the feeling the Crimson Eye had given him. Whoever it was helping the Dogons. They weren't nearly on the same level as whoever was behind the greed seed. Not even close. When he thought of this, Silas' emotions settled down. There was only one thing to consider in a situation like this one, and that was growing stronger. The reason he had put the statue away this time instead of continuing to study it was twofold. First, it would take time and the benefits were unlikely to be immediate. That said, there would no doubt be heavy long-term benefits. And second, the reason why it wouldn't be immediate was a bit troublesome to describe and it folded into several other issues. Silas hadn't been there to hear Ragnar's curses about the destruction of his tattoos, but he could make some guesses now. There were only two ways to make use of these runes, a temporary method and a permanent method. Both required a large amount of mental strength, but the former was especially taxing. The temporary method involved forging the runes mid-battle and infusing them into your flesh. This required a great deal of skill, and the consumption not only in the creation but in the sustaining of it would be astronomical. By comparison, one could use treasures to create dyes that could make it more permanent. Silas hadn't known about this method in the past, but after observing the statue, he noticed the presence of several vitality-rich dyes that were used to paint it. These dice carried the air of blood essence, so they couldn't have possibly been chosen casually. However, he also had a strong enough sense for blood essence to know that there were several other things mixed in. Due to this, he made the deduction. However, he was certain that these things were likely to be very expensive. He could get the blood essence himself through Extricate, which would definitely make the cost much cheaper than it was for Ragnar. But he would still need to buy the other stuff. Scylla's rune soul was already too heavily involved in his combat style for him to tack on yet another responsibility to it. His wisdom would have to be at least a magnitude greater before he felt comfortable doing such a thing. What was interesting was that the Dogons most definitely used the second method, but according to Nosfaline, they were still hyper-aware of the state of their stamina. It was clear that Scylla's was yet again an anomaly in this regard. Because he was pretty confident in using the second method with ease. However, that would take time to sort out. He would also likely need to find Ragnar to figure out how the man had deduced the materials he needed for the rune ink. Regardless, right now, Scylla's had finally pivoted to something else that had been on his mind. "Protect me," Scylla's said calmly. Nosfaline nodded, though she didn't know what Scylla's wanted to do. She was still surprised by how he managed to take the statue away. But at this point, she would just have to accept anything this monster did with open arms. Scylla's took a seat where the statue had once been and felt a great deal of energy surging into him. It seemed that the Dogons weren't completely careless with the statue. Part of the reason a vacuum had formed was because there was an underground network of ether stones feeding into it. He would definitely have to investigate that later. But for now, Scylla's brought out the Spider Queen's corpse. Path of the Mancer, common quest. You have displayed a tenacious will and a sharp intent for battle, but you are missing the final piece to your power. Following the path of another is easy, following your own is much more difficult. The word Mancer has a storied history, deeper than you know. There are many complex definitions, but it can be boiled down to a single word: control. Open up the path of the Mancer or die trying. Common reward requirements. Greater than kill a level 20 creature with the ice poison path of the Mancer, OR. Greater than kill a level 20 creature with ice path of the Mancer. Greater than kill a level 20 creature with poison path of the Mancer, OR. Greater than kill a level 20 creature with compatible path of the Mancer, greater than find common evolution stone. There was just one thing that Scylla's was missing. A so-called common evolution stone. However, what is a common evolution stone? A common evolution stone is similar to a gene state elixir. It warms up the body and allows it to be prepared for an overhaul. The process can be extremely painful. It is a method usually left to those not in an abundant state of wealth or without special constitutions. The problem with this was that quests were very particular. He had failed not long ago purely because he had overshot the request of a quest. It would be hard to believe if he could undershoot it, even if his body was well equipped. If he had known that he would stumble into an opportunity like this, he would have tried to see if he could trade for one from the System City Nexus. Though, he probably would have run out of money anyway. Scylla's opened his eyes and shook his head. It was no good. It wasn't allowing him to complete the quest. He could only sigh. He had expected as much, but he just wanted to try. Just as he stood, ready to go and check out what he thought might be an ether stone mine below, there was a sudden rush of air and a split appeared in the skies. Scylla's eyes brightened. A portal was forming. It seemed that he would have his opportunity to trade for the common evolution stone he needed quite soon. Chapter 524, System-Wide Message. The influx of ether must have stabilized this region ahead of time, Nosfaline spoke as they watched the formation of the portal together. Scylla's eyes brightened. This was good timing indeed. This portal should directly lead to the woodland territory, which meant that he would be able to use his territory key much earlier than expected. At that point, he would have 3 system cities under his control and free reign over their nexuses. This was precisely what he needed right now. When the portal was large enough, the two entered quite swiftly. In the far-off distance, a pair of eyes watched with a light of rage in them. He had lost everything. The woodland territory was probably classified as a tropical dry forest by Earth's geographical standards. These were regions with short but heavy rain seasons, followed by long dry seasons. Trees in these regions had deep networks of roots and had evolved to be capable of spending long periods of time without rainfall. Compared to the wasteland Silas expected to find, this was certainly leagues better. There were plentiful trees and cacti around, as well as many mountainous slopes that extended into the distance with heavy fog hanging over them. The portal had appeared pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Even after extending his visualization, or rather his sixth sense as Nosvalin called it, he didn't find anything but beasts that were likely to be rushing over here with quite some swiftness. It's unfortunate. The underground city will probably be overrun by more beasts now. There'll definitely be a clash between the native poisonous population and this new one. Silas shook his head. He felt that there was definitely more to gain from the city, especially with the underground ether stone mine. Ether stone mines were incredibly rare. There were probably a handful in every territory, but the city stellar abilities of the system cities couldn't peak very far underground. So finding them was a task that would require someone with a geotechnical engineering profession of some sort. Silas knew that he definitely couldn't leave that ether stone mine. After just a few weeks of using the ether stones he got from the sylphs in the dungeon with impunity, he was already close to running out. He was also certain that he had yet to find out the best uses for ether stones just yet. He had yet to look into it, but he bet that Nosvalin would know a thing or two. Silas took out a shimmering key from the madness key. It was about the length of his forearm and was wrapped in a viney wood pattern and a grainy sand. The moment it appeared in the woodland territory, it shook. For a moment, Silas hesitated. Right now, his name had been locked off the merit leaderboard. Lucius would have every reason to believe that he was dead. If he conquered this territory, it would almost certainly trigger a phenomenon that would be picked up by those here, and soon enough, if the Grimblade's information network was as robust as he thought it was, it would make it back to Lucius. In that case, should he even do this? No. Silas held the key out, stabilizing its trembling. Whoever it was that placed the warrant out for his arrest would definitely know whether he was alive or not. And unless they died, every Grimblade would know that he was still alive for the taking. In that case, he would let Lucius enjoy his sleepless nights until the day he came to get his head. And if anyone harmed his family in the meantime, there would be more than death waiting on the other end of his fist. He turned the key. A ripple of ether spread across the woodland territory as far as the eyes could see. Every human, beast, or living being in the region all felt it at once. System-wide message. The Royal Line system has been unlocked. As the first Royal of Earth, Silas Grimblade will be awarded the title less than Woodland Warlord and has earned the right to establish a bloodline. Even Silas' gaze flickered. He hadn't been expecting this at all, but before he could digest it, a fluttering scroll appeared before him. By now, his experience was great enough that he recognized it as a template. As for what the template was for, it should be either related to his authority as the Woodland Warlord or this so-called bloodline. Quite quickly, he got his answer. It was the latter. The scroll fell into his hands and he felt a strong connection with it form before it disappeared into his body. After that, he subconsciously understood how it worked. I see, so this is how they did it. After grasping blood essence, Silas felt that just upgrading your genes wasn't enough to pass on a unique gene like the Grimblades or the other hidden families did. Genes, even unique genes, were too fleeting. A child might keep a portion of it, but by the third generation, it would already be less than half effective. By the fourth, it might not exist at all. The only way to establish a family line was to root it in your blood essence. Only once a unique gene had established a connection with such a thing would it be possible. However, for most, this was impossible. It took over 1 million free experience points before Silas managed to gain control of blood essence, and that didn't even mention the fact that he needed to unlock a legendary path. Profession first. How many people could do that? As such, these people instead needed a bloodline template. This blood template, up to a certain standard, allowed any gene that the ancestor of a bloodline formed to be rooted in their blood essence. In this case, it was up to a silver grade standard. From now on, any improvements he made to himself within that limit would have a better than 90% chance of being passed down in whole to his children. And by the same token, his blood had suddenly become extremely valuable. Chapter 525, Woodland Warlord. Title unlocked. Title, Woodland Warlord. The Woodland Territory is now your territory. The land is your land, the rain is your rain, its blood is your blood. Woodland Curse Seal, suppress the stats of any target within your territory to 50%, Quasi-King Crown, the territory obeys you. With a thought, 2 changes occurred to Scylla's body. First was the shimmering seal that appeared in front of his forehead. It looked almost like the emblem of an emperor, swimming around with all sorts of complex runes and grafts that gave it an ancient and oppressive feel. This was none other than the Woodland Curse Seal. When he activated it, he could use it in 2 ways. The first was to suppress those in his presence, and the second was to implant a curse into the body of a target. With the latter method, the person could still flee, but every time they stepped into his territory, he would not only sense it, but their stats would also plummet. The second change was the flickering half-crown above his head. When Silas felt it, it was like a surge of power was coursing through his veins. Much like the Quasi-King beasts, he didn't experience any changes to his stats, and yet it still felt like everything was resting in the palm of his hands, waiting for him to take control. The ether listened to his commands more fluidly, he could cast skills faster and with better precision, and he felt like his rune soul had been pumped with steroids, displaying a power that was easily tens of times better than it was in the past. He felt like so long as he was in his woodland territory, he would even be capable of using the runes on the scorpion armor with much greater ease. Silas made a mental note that if he wanted to practice runes, the best place to do so would certainly be right here. It was like everything he wanted to learn from the world was whispered right into his very ears. So this is what it feels like to be one of those beasts. If I were to fight the Spider Queen in this territory, I wouldn't struggle nearly as much even if I didn't use the curse seal. Silas exhaled a breath. He didn't just gain these things either. He could feel that some of the pressure the system had placed on him had loosened a bit. That meant that he had gained a merit, and not a normal one either. Killing the Spider Queen was only worth a hollow merit if he was correct, so he hadn't felt much of a change. But for there to be such a great change now, it could only mean that he had at least earned a true merit just now, and that was huge. Unfortunately, he would need 99 more true merits before he could offset just 1 silver demerit. He had a long way to go before this monkey was off his back. But he wasn't done yet. Silas stood in the third and last system city of his territory, having already conquered and sacrificed the other 2 for 2 million free experience points. He had even more freedom as the woodland warlord than he ever did as the city lord. Not only could he freely come and go in this territory as he pleased, but he could likewise bend and twist the rules to his liking as well. In the previous 2 system cities, he had just casually swiped their tax money, and not even the system could stop him. What good was their tax money if he was going to liquidate the system city anyway for free experience points? Now, he had over 20 million coins to his name and a nexus to peruse through. The items in the nexus weren't any different than the ones he had already seen in the other system cities, so he didn't bother to go to a place he had been before and just went directly to where he would find a common evolution stone. Luckily, he managed to find several, but the prices were eye-watering. A common evolution stone cost over 10 million. A bronze one, which he might end up needing for his next class upgrade, was 10 times that. And a silver one, the last grade available here, was worth 100 times that. Silas shook his head. If he could help it, he wouldn't add much more to his affinities. The woodland spider queen was too good to miss out on, and he was also running out of time. But there was no way he would have 1 billion coins by the time he needed a silver grade evolution stone, let alone the fact he would still need a gold and legendary one beyond that. Silas directly traded for the common evolution stone and finally got the window he was looking for. Bronze Beast Destiny consumed. Gluttony Seed has strengthened. Quest rewards changed. Woodland Frost King, common. The tundra is your domain and poison adorns your chalice, the trees are your friend and the earth warms your bed. Plus 5/5 mental. Plus 6/5 constitution. Stat limit increase, plus 1/8 per level. Free stats, plus 8 per level. Class modifier, 0.24 intelligence, 0.24 wisdom, 0.24 charisma, 0.24 constitution. Class, Woodland Frost King. Level, 0. Greater than basic skills. Woodland Frost Domain, FFF plus skill. Special damage, 50 per second. Restrains and traps. Special buff, plus 40% to all wood, ice, and poison skills used. Woodland Spirit Summon, FFF plus skill. For less than 50 units of ether, summon a woodland spirit with 50% of your stats to fight on your behalf. Attribute, Wood Poison. Woodland Spirit Swallow, FFF plus skill. Swallow summoned woodland spirit to accelerate healing proportional to constitution. For every 50 points of constitution, boost healing capacity by less than plus 500% greater than Woodland Frost Spike, FFF, skill. Damage, 300. Special damage, 80 sec for 5 seconds. Attribute, Wood Ice Poison. Greater than basic affinities. Ice, Quasi Gold. Poison, Quasi Gold. Ice Poison, Silver. Wood, Quasi Silver. Wood Poison, Bronze. Wood Ice Poison, Common, Earth, Common, greater than, unlockables. Level 20. End of Volume 4. Chapter 526, Breather. Silas nodded to himself when he saw the skills he gained. He was especially fond of the attack skill. Woodland Frost Spike, FFF, skill. Damage, 300. Special damage, 80 sec for 5 seconds. Attribute, Wood Ice Poison. It wasn't anything crazy, but it was far better than less than chilling Scythewis, and even far better than less than chilling Scythe Mutant by a large margin as well. This should be the skill that had pierced through his lung. If it was going to almost take his life, it had better be powerful. And from what he could tell, the synergy between this attack skill and the domain skill was incredible. The attack he had suffered through his chest was definitely far greater than 300 damage. 300 damage alone wouldn't even make it through his ether skin, let alone damage him to that extent. Of course, the 300 damage limit here was just referring to a fragmented mastery. It would probably be upwards of a 1000 damage once it reached legendary. Still, Silas was quite sure that with the Woodland Frost domain activated, the power would at least be 50% greater. While he was observing the skills, Silas could feel the changes to his body as well. The first time he advanced his class, he had been in a terrible state triggered by consuming too many elixirs, so the process had been particularly painful. This time, due to the fact he was in relatively decent health and now had the dual-class constitution, it was smooth sailing. He could feel his stat limits wanting to loosen, and he bet that if he went back to his original training regimen, the one he had teased out thanks to Olivia, he could gain a few dozen extra stats points with relative ease. However, he wasn't sure if he had the time for that. The moment Silas had this thought, he paused. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and then exhaled slowly. No, I need to take a breather. There were many things he wanted to do. Return to Castlemaine, revenge against Lucius, making sure his family was safe, completing the Rune Enlightenment chain quest. However, not a single one of those things could be done with immediacy. He was across the ocean from the nearest portal to Castlemaine he knew of. Lucius was definitely not an existence he could handle casually, and he had no idea where he was in relation to the exact location of the final destination of his Rune Enlightenment chain quest. If he just started running around, he would be effectively wasting his time. Not to mention the fact his stats were still halved currently, the system was out to get him. He had a silver demerit to his name that would ensure anywhere he stepped just might be the last death trap he fell into. Rushing was going to get him nowhere. When he changed his perspective, he relaxed somewhat. I have 7 months before the timer for my Mansa quest runs out. Kasari is facing the same timeline for hers. I took too long to find a level 20 beast. If I could manage to find a level 31 in my woodland territory, that would be ideal. There's also the matter of my comprehension. With my dual-class constitution, I can fuse with a second one, and the fusion crystal can allow me to take on a third one. I haven't put nearly as much effort into this. This region is also one that I can sense is ideal for the growth of the bone-tailed lizard. There are many poisonous beasts in the region, and the odds that I can find a level 30 creature of the Mansa path worth the upgrade and help the infant beast progress at the same time is high. Silas realized that he needed to strike a balance. He was basically invincible in this region, and his ability to progress here would be much faster. He also had direct access to the Afrikor continent, which should be the location where he would complete the last leg of his Rune Enlightenment quest as well, according to all his research. It would be foolish of him to not take advantage of improving here as quickly as possible. With the City Stellae ability at his fingertips, he could find all the best resources in the region and plunder them for himself. I will give myself exactly 1 month of time. It would be the longest downtime Silas had spent since the summoning had come down. Well, it would be if he ignored the time he spent in the Grimblade family waiting around for the draft. But even that had only been a week or so at most. There would be another benefit to this choice of his as well, and that was the fact he could keep this nexus. A nexus was a hub that was meant to allow communication and exchange between those on a world. Although lower-grade nexuses couldn't communicate with higher-grade ones, the vice versa was possible. Meaning, Silas could very well use this silver-grade nexus to establish a line of connection with Castlemaine and get an understanding of what was happening over there as well. In fact, he would even be able to use a function he had never had the time for before and even meet with chaosheir within the nexus. Although they would just be projections of one another, a small arc still appeared on the corners of his lips. He was somewhat looking forward to it. But maybe only as natural, there always seemed to be something acting on his life to make it more complicated. This time, however, it was something that Silas had pretty much expected to happen. There was a rumble that shook the entire woodland territory. Silas knew exactly what it was the moment it was triggered. The woodland territory was fusing with the sandy plains of the Afrikor continent. With 2 system cities conquered, it was inevitable. Chapter 527, Instructor. Silas stepped outside, curious about what sort of process this might be. Part of Earth completing the summoning was related to the ether plane successfully fusing into Earth. But it was hard to say exactly what this would mean. The woodland territory was in a unique situation due to his interference. Not only were the runes in the region rapidly healing, but without the tug from several different locations on the ether plane, a rubber banding effect had occurred. The woodland territory had been trying to return to its appropriate coordinates for a long time now. When it was suddenly set free, it created a snapback effect that caused its fusion to accelerate. Silas hadn't deduced this. Instead, he asked the Madness Key directly because this was far above his pay grade. He still didn't quite understand how things worked. Why was an ether plane even necessary? Why not just directly evolve Earth itself? Where did the ether plane come from? Had it always been a part of Earth? Or was it added after the fact, maybe by the system? All of these questions were apparently taboos, though, so he could only speculate. Hours later, the rumbling stopped and Silas was surprised to find that not much had changed at all. Or, maybe everything had changed depending on your perspective. The ether plane had just directly displaced the land of Earth. An abundance of ether spilled forth, but this time, there was no beast tide effect. This might be a good thing. The underground city shouldn't have been destroyed, I don't think. It's probably buried in the same location. The Madness Key claims that there should be efforts to preserve structures that are already there. It's mostly the nature itself that's been changed. So the ether stone mine should also be there. Silas returned to the Nexus and found the bird's eye view of a certain location. As expected, in the original location, there were a horde of disoriented beasts, but they were already dispersing. The odds that Ragnar is now in my woodland territory is also quite high. Silas was still mulling over whether he should waste time cleaning up his territory or not. As with basically every territory of the ether plane, there were existences already here, various powers that had made it their own. They were undoubtedly unhappy with his actions, understandably. But there also wasn't much they could do to stop him. Their movements were completely under his control thanks to his bird's eye view of the entire region. His strength was on an untouchable level, and he had the ability to curse them on top of that if it came to it. On top of all of that, he had yet to conquer this last system city, so all the soldiers and generals within were fully under his control. That included the current acting city lord. Meaning, if he really wanted to, he could order them to go raze a few cities to the ground. Normally, a system city wouldn't be allowed to interfere with people taking part in the summoning like this. But Silas was the one in effective control of them now, so it wasn't a problem at all. All of that made it a waste of time to think about clearing them out now. They simply weren't a threat to him at all. But on the other hand, he also wasn't very comfortable with just leaving hidden dangers lying around. Let's play it by ear for now. Maybe doing things this way will force Ragnar to show his tail. The smart thing for Ragnar to do would be to just directly escape. However, Silas had a feeling he wouldn't do that. The underground city was too important for him, and if he cut his losses now, he would be left with absolutely nothing. Using these powers to try and lure Ragnar out might be exactly the sort of mousetrap he needed. After making this choice, Silas chose to enter the Nexus again. First, he sent a connection request to Castlemaine, then he entered the stores again. He still had millions of coins to spend and many things he needed. Upgrading his knowledge of runes, finding methods to accelerate his comprehension improvement, and maybe finding a few ways to improve his method of training might be good as well. The last of the three was probably the least necessary. There were many facilities to take advantage of in the system city that he had yet to, including gravity rooms and the like outside of the skill improvement rooms. So, Silas mostly focused on the first two. World of Runes, Secrets. Limited access, rune visualization must be awakened. Cost, 30,000 F coins. Ether, runes, and the mind, secrets. Limited access, rune enlightenment must be awakened. Cost, 100,000 F coins. The life of runes, secrets. Limited access, rune breath must be awakened. Cost, 3 million F coins. Silas bought them all. The first two he had seen before, but the last was a new edition only available in the Silver Nexus. Unfortunately, there was nothing for rune flesh and definitely nothing for rune soul, but maybe that was a good thing. Considering the price for the life of runes, even if there was, he certainly wouldn't be able to afford it. Although he had a feeling that he might not learn much from the first two, he still wanted to go through them. There was too much miscellaneous information about runes that he didn't understand, and he didn't want to rely on Nosfailing to get them. It took him a while of poking around for comprehension help before he found something he believed could help. As was a pattern for him, he found it in an expected place. There was a certain section of the Nexus designed for those with professions to set up shop. They were housed by either those with merchant professions or those that got templates for temporary usage. These stalls weren't very filled as one might expect. Silas had to descend to the Bronze Nexus before he could find any at all. Among them, there was someone with a martial arts instructor profession who had used a template to set up a stall. He was selling general competency in combat, something that was invaluable to either city lords who wanted to quickly build up the skill of their people or new summons who had no idea what they were doing in this new dog-eat-dog world. It was when Silas saw this stall that he had a sudden flash of understanding. He was trying so hard to build his comprehension towards some holistic martial arts, but he was basing it all on memories of professionals he had seen fighting on television. Why? Sure, it had worked because his memory was excellent, and many of those professional fighters of old Earth were certainly powerhouses by now. But, was that the best way? He only had one fist skill and one gene talent that could somewhat be used with his legs but was more designed to be used with a tail. If he was really serious, he should be looking through more martial arts skills. So he made a decision. Going back to the skill libraries, he sorted by martial arts skills and began a buying frenzy. Chapter 528 Focused. Focused Punch, F, skill. Plus 10% attack. Focused Kick, F, skill. Plus 10% attack. Focused Palm, F, skill. Plus 10% attack. Focused Finger, F, skill. Plus 10% attack. Silas was surprised by the sheer number of them. They were clearly a series of sorts, but they were perfect for his needs. Each one was as simple as they got. They taught principles of strengthening one at the point of attack, gathering strength and exploding with it at the perfect instant of time. There were easily over a dozen of these skills, ranging from more common forms of attacks like punching to less common ones like claw strikes or even knees. However, Silas realized that after the first one, he had wasted his money on the rest of the focus skill series. The principles were all exactly the same. For someone with a LV-12 taboo bond path talent supporting his comprehension of his body, it was easy for him to translate the principles of one to the next. He didn't mind it because they were all extremely cheap, just a few hundred F coins each. But he kept this in mind for a future date. I see. It seems that the use of the tendons is a much higher form. Silas had once again skipped steps. He had mastered the ability to use his tendons as levers to make his attacks truly pop, but he had yet to excavate all the potential in his muscles alone. The focus series of martial arts was all about lending the entire body to one attack and combining that with the flow and movement of ether. If Silas had to boil down its core secrets and distill them into a summary, he would say that it fell into two main categories. Leverage and timing. Leverage encompassed not only taking into account your body and that of an opponent, in addition to what changes might occur during the process of an attack, but also something that Silas had heard coaches of various fighting arts say many times before. Attacking a target through an opponent, rather than attacking the opponent him or herself. If you imagined yourself punching or kicking through someone, the power output would theoretically be much greater. The problem with that, though, is if you took this principle too far, you might end up dealing a blow that had yet to reach its apex strength. That was what timing was all about, striking a balance between wanting to put a hole in your opponent and allowing your strength to peak at just the right times. When Silas understood this concept, he found that it was particularly easy to translate it to all aspects. Still, Silas felt that some of these skills were just gimmicks. Less than focus finger felt ridiculous. The amount of reinforcement he would need to add to his fingers so that they wouldn't snap on contact made it far from worth it. Although the piercing power would be great, if you didn't overwhelm your opponent in constitution, you would only be able to use it once. Silas could circumvent this issue with his telekinesis, but he didn't think it was strictly necessary for him to be able to attack in this way when his fist was so much more effective. Less than focus claw was ridiculous for the same reasons. It wasn't as though he had the sharp claws of a beast. Whether it was less than focus finger greater than, less than focus claw greater than, or any other skills of a similar ilk, unless there was an additional protection or layer of complexity in using ether, they weren't worth his time. But Silas wasn't trying to just add new skills to his arsenal. His main goal was to better his foundation so that he could awaken a truly powerful comprehension. Even if he could find a skill that could protect his fingers or form real claws for him, he wouldn't be interested in it. Still, the improvement was basically immediate. Dormant comprehensions. Greater than boxing, FFF+. Greater than taekwondo, FFF+. Greater than Muay Thai, FFF+. Greater than. Greater than mixed martial arts, FF+. Greater than. Greater than blazing wool, F. Mixed martial arts had improved to FF+ from F+, and blazing wool seemed to have reached from unranked. Though, this was likely unrelated to the focus series skills. Silas was quite interested in blazing wool, though he didn't know exactly what it was. When he asked the madness key, it was incredibly vague, just making a general description of wool, which he had found odd. However, after feeling the changes to his wool and how similar it was to a progenitor flame, he seemed to understand why that was. The madness key likely couldn't give him a solid answer because even his wool didn't know what it was just yet. If it was on its way to becoming a progenitor flame, then the ability it awakened was still up in the air. Silas wasn't worried about it too much, though. Because of his dual-class constitution and the fusion crystal, he could add a third comprehension to himself. So while he was waiting for his blazing wool to manifest itself down a path, he could add another first. Usually, silver-grade fusion crystals could only help you add a second comprehension, but his dual-class constitution made such treasures doubly as effective. The real question was how to raise his mixed martial arts to FFF+ as well, and he already knew the answer. Interlocking chains, F, skill set. Serpent's embrace, F, skill set. Serpent's embrace, F, skill set. Harmonizing lock, F+, skill set. Unity hold, FF, skill set. Twisting lotus, FF, skill set. Synchronized flow, FF+, skill set. Fusion grapple, FFF, skill set. Celestial bind, FFF, skill set. Phoenix's embrace, FFF+, skill set. Vortex capture, F, gene skill set. Staring at the list of grappling skills, Silas felt that he had made good choices. He would trade for them one by one, ignoring the expense. As so-called skill sets, they were more expensive than normal skills because they taught more general ether application methods and several stances. As such, they were on average 10 times more expensive than skills and gene skills of the same level. However, because of that, he didn't seem to have enough money to make it all the way through. Chapter 529, Interlocking Chains. After buying up everything he needed for his rune mastery path, Silas only had a little over 7 million F coins left. That wasn't enough to buy all of these skill sets. Well, he would only need a little over 1 million to buy all the ones from F to FFF+, but the real problem was the gene skill that would cost him more than the 7 million he had all on its own. Silas also hadn't forgotten that trading for a counter-gene skill would remove the warrant lording over his head right now. But as things were going, he wouldn't be able to afford that either. After some thought, Silas shook his head. He planned on staying here for a month, and within this woodland territory, he would be nigh invincible. The improvement of his foundation was more important than anything else right now. In fact, because of his senses toward his body, if a Grimblade was nearby and using the warrant to track him down, he was actually confident in reverse tracking them. He planned on making quite a great deal of money in the coming weeks, so even if he didn't have the funds now, that didn't mean that he wouldn't in the future. Taking this one step at a time, he traded for less than interlocking chains greater than. Interlocking chains, F, skill set. Your arms and legs link as solid as iron chains. A dance with your embrace means frustration, suffocation, and eventually death for your opponent. When the skill set was taken into his mind, Silas found that his mind became flooded with various forms. This isn't something I can practice on my own. Not long later, Silas had a general of the city called in. He was a middle-aged man with a robust build, which was quite a common figure amongst the soldiers of the system city. He was known as General G. "We'll be grappling," Silas said. "No need to remove your armor. I won't be able to ask my opponents in the future to do so." General G seemed confused, but obliged nonetheless. Unfortunately, the city didn't have any grappling experts among the strong. But most opponents Silas met wouldn't be grappling experts either. However, what they would be was extremely strong, and General G met those requirements. Less than interlocking chains was a skill set, so it didn't teach a single powerful attack. Instead, it had 2 death positions, and about 8 transitions. The 2 so-called death positions referred to an arm lock and a leg lock, both around the neck. The transitions were where the real meat of the skill set was. It taught how to read and react to an opponent's movements, using their weight and actions against them to pull them further and further into the trap. All you have to do is focus on resisting. For now, use about half your strength and don't use a weapon. Understood, Warlord, General G nodded. The 2 stood about a meter apart, and Silas took a breath, going over everything in his mind before he took a strong step forward. General G tensed as Silas' palm reached for his chest. He slapped down with a palm to hit Silas' attack away. The solid strike reverberated against Silas, and his arm felt like it might shatter. He wasn't using his crown right now, so even though General G was only using half of his strength, the gap between their physicals while the warrant was still active was too great. However, Silas had already expected this. His second half snaked forward as his stance shifted. It was hard to describe the feeling for General G, but it was almost as though Silas' movements had become softer, more flexible. He already learned from the failure of the first palm. This time, when General G slapped out, he missed, hitting against the inside of Silas' elbow. Silas' arm bent naturally, continuing to flow forward. Though its trajectory had changed, he still managed to grab a hold of General G's pauldron, gripping tightly into a seam and pulling the man closer. General G struck out at Silas' chest to force some distance, but Silas had already spun to the side, using General G's pauldron as an anchor to spin himself around to his back. The general's strong body was nothing more than a detriment to him at this point. He didn't even tilt to the side as Silas used him like this, allowing the latter to accelerate his movement to his back without worrying about sprawling away. Silas clamped himself down on General G's back, wrapping his legs around his waist and his arms around his neck. Panic set into General G's eyes as he grabbed a hand toward Silas' arm. But it felt like he had suddenly tried to grip onto a sturdy chain. His throat felt constricted and his body shuddered. In a desperate attempt to change the situation, the general accelerated backward, slamming his back along with Silas into a wall. Silas coughed, all the air in his body being forced out in a single sudden burst. His grip loosened, and General G used the opportunity to rip himself free, looking to flip Silas over his shoulder. Silas felt the world spin around him, but he kept his senses about him. He had been through much worse than losing a little air from his lungs. This wasn't enough to shift his focus. His arm twisted in the grip General G had on it, grabbing onto the general's forearm at the same time. As he soared over the latter's shoulder, his legs shifted in the air and his body contorted. General G suddenly found himself soaring through the air as well. Bang! The general's back slammed into the ground, only to find another strong hold around his neck. This time, however, it was Silas's legs. His throat was pinned by Silas's inner thighs, and his face was already blue before he could react. He tried to use his full strength on instinct, but it was already too late. Between the back of his head slamming into the ground and the circulation being cut off from his head, he stood no chance. Chapter 530, Grappling. Silas released his grip on General G's neck, standing with a heaving breath. Grappling was dangerous. If not for the sake of his comprehension, he wasn't sure if he would do this. Plus, there was an obvious problem to it all. The fact that with how large beasts got sometimes, what good was a leg lock if his legs couldn't wrap around him at all? It seemed silly to work on a skill that wouldn't be useful against such a large segment of his opponents. But he felt that if he couldn't use weapons like most people could, then he should have every method of protecting himself possible within reason. Grappling was something most people didn't understand and could be great when he was facing off against an opponent he couldn't easily defeat through normal means. Keep going. Silas practically ran the poor General G into the ground. The general lost count of the number of times he passed out. He thought that he would get a reprieve when he could finally start using his full strength, but the ending was the same. When he thought that using his weapon would be his saving grace, he ended up almost taking his own head off several times. When Silas finally allowed him to use skills, he might as well have not had the opportunity to use them at all. He found the skills getting constantly cancelled, and even when he managed to complete his ether circulation, Silas was restricting his movements in a way that he would have to kamikaze them both to get any sort of damage in. The more Silas fought, the more he felt that grappling was practically a poetic sort of experience. He could feel his opponent's breathing, movement, even panic in a way so intimate that nothing could compare. The kind of control it gave him over someone's life was intoxicating in its own way, and he seemed to completely forget the hatred he had for the movement. It only took him 3 quick spars with General G to master less than interlocking chains greater than. When it hit legendary mastery, he could feel its limits intimately, so he moved on to less than serpent's embrace greater than, not bothering to try to improve it to progenitor mastery. Progenitor mastery required not just understanding, but improvement on a technique. Silas didn't have the time to invest in it, and it was just an F skill set regardless, so it wasn't worth it even if he did have the time. Although he had given himself a month, he took every day like it was his very last. Less than serpent's embrace improved the rigid movements of less than interlocking chains a great deal. Compared to less than interlocking chains greater than, S8 transitions, less than serpent's embrace had only 4, but they were all streamlined and focused on flexibility in a way that made them applicable to a vast array of situations, far more than less than interlocking chains greater than, S8 transitions could compare to. Sometimes Silas even moved as though he didn't have any bones at all, and he learned how to use the muscles of his torso to move around his opponent's body with more fluidity. That process of movement allowed the pressure on his arms and legs to lessen so they could focus on latching onto vital points and squeezing down. Even when General G thought that he had control over Silas's limbs, a light twist and shift could find him spinning through the air again. Less than harmonizing lock and less than unity hold were extremely similar in their actions. They focused on using the opponent's methods against them, almost like constrictors. The more General G struggled, the more it seemed like he was suffocating. The difference, though, was that less than unity hold greater than, the first FF skill set of the bunch, was where the suffocation tactics truly became shocking. Less than unity hold transitions and death holds blurred into one another. The transitions became part of the suffocating process, focusing on applying pressure onto an opponent's chest, constricting their ability to breathe easily, and timing transitions with their breaths to force asphyxiation. By the time Silas was mastering less than unity hold greater than, General G was practically crying real tears. It was like no matter how hard he tried to breathe, he would get a face full of humid air and carbon dioxide. By the time Silas got to legendary mastery, a half day later, General G passed out before Silas even got a hold on his neck. He struggled to the point of turning blue in the face, and his heart almost burst out of his chest. At that point, Silas was forced to give General G a break. He stood slowly, his breathing heavy and his body drenched in sweat. He left the region, took a shower, ate a mountain of beasts the System City Army caught for him, and then went to bed. In this month, he wouldn't just take his training seriously, but his recovery as well. When he woke up, he sent a signal for a new general to make their way to his training ground in a few hours. But first, he planned on spending some time on his rune mastery. As pleasurable as grappling was, he couldn't lose himself in it indefinitely. If there was going to be anything that could fix the main weaknesses of grappling, it was going to be runes. Plus. Greater than mixed martial arts, FFF+. He had only mastered up to less than unity hold greater than, and only had a rudimentary fragmented mastery of less than twizzling lotus greater than, the FF grade skill. But that seemed enough for his mixed martial arts comprehension to reach this level. This made Silas realize that he truly wasn't satisfied with these comprehensions. He had managed to raise his boxing comprehension to FFF+ just by remembering television he had watched, and now it only took mastering an FF skill set to legendary to gain an FFF+ mixed martial arts comprehension. It just felt hollow. Compared to the mystery and intrigue surrounding his madness comprehension, even though it was only FFF, these comprehensions seemed a far cry from that. He wasn't really sure how to proceed, and the madness key wasn't helpful with such broad questions, so he chose to shift gears for now. World of Runes, Secrets.